Good morning. I'm Pete Daly, CEO and publisher of the U.S. Naval Institute, and welcome to Defense Forum Washington. Our theme today is implementing integrated deterrence. And before we get going, I just ask you, now that we've asked you all to sit down, to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Again, I welcome all our attendees, and I'd like to acknowledge our conference sponsors who have helped us put on this event, and that's Leonardo DRS, Lockheed Martin, and Mantech, who's represented by David Hathaway, who's the Executive Vice President and General Manager for the Defense Sector. Hi, Dave. And I think Red Hoover's here, who heads up the Navy segment. Hey, Red. Before we begin, one housekeeping remark. Our speakers will allow time for questions, but please use the standing mics, which allows everybody in the room to hear, and it also allows the people who are remote to follow the program. So the concept of integrated deterrence is prominently featured in the National Security Strategy and the recently released, which was a good idea to share it, unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy. And our goal today is to gain a deeper understanding of what integrated deterrence is and how it's going to work across warfighting domains, across different theaters, and how it'll be integrated with different departments within the government. No small task. So we're going to ask how it's being implemented. How does integrated deterrence work in a theater and an area like the South China Sea, which was a good example. I think the Commandant of the Marine Corps said this a couple years ago, but he said, if deterrence is working, how is it that every week the Chinese built up those islands in the South China Sea while we knew exactly what they were doing and it still happened? So how do we control things like that? How do we shape the environment better? So we're honored to have a distinguished group of speakers to address some of these important points. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our kickoff speaker, Dr. Mara Carlin, who's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capability. She's served in a national security role for 5 different Secretaries of Defense. Former roles include Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. She had service on the policy team for the Biden-Harris transition. She was Director of Strategic Studies and an Associate Professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And she worked as a non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings. So before stepping into her current position, she was also performing, it's worth noting, the duties of the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So Dr. Carlin, we're so glad you're here. We're looking forward to your thoughts and perspective on integrated deterrence. And let's welcome Dr. Mara Carlin.
All right, good morning. How's everyone doing today? Are we awake? We have an important topic to talk about, so I want to make sure everyone is awake enough. All right, so my plan this morning is to spend a few minutes talking about the concept of integrated deterrence as we understand it, and then I really look forward to tackling your hard questions. So I'm going to assume that if you're in this audience, you have already read the National Defense Strategy. Is that a safe assumption? All right, if it's not a safe assumption, I hope you have plans this afternoon to do so. Because it's a pretty big deal, right? Every 4 years, the Congress requires that the U.S. Department of Defense comes out and says, here's what our plans are. Here's what we are trying to do. And indeed, this time we delivered the classified strategy with the largest defense budget request in our history. So I strongly recommend that you go through it to try to understand what is it that your Department of Defense is trying to do. Why does it think it needs $773 billion to try to realize that strategy? So when you read the strategy, you're going to see 2 really important points. This is kind of the bottom line up front of things to take away from that National Defense Strategy before I talk about integrated deterrence. Number 1, bottom line up front. For the very first time in the US Department of Defense's history, we did our major strategic reviews together. The National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review. They were all done by a cohort of folks who were trying really hard to understand what does that future security environment look like? How do challengers and adversaries understand all the tools in their toolbox? And how do we understand all the tools in our toolbox? Doing them all together for the very first time in Department of Defense history meant that we had intellectual coherence, intellectual consistency, and then resource consistency. So that's number one big takeaway. The number two big takeaway that I want you to get from that National Defense Strategy is that focus on the urgent need to sustain and strengthen deterrence, looking at the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, as our pacing challenge. And the reason for this, frankly, and this is a notable difference from the last strategy in 2018, is that we see there is no country in the world with the intent and increasingly the capabilities to fundamentally reshape the geopolitical security order. And we see that, right? It's not just a military story, it's a diplomatic story, it's an economic story, it's across all of the tools. So that's the other big takeaway that I want you all to have when you go through and read that strategy. So let's talk about integrated deterrence, which is a kind of catchphrase that I suspect you all have been hearing a good deal about over these last few months. And I find the best way to understand integrated deterrence is to take it as two words, right? Let's break it up. Let's talk about who are we integrating, what are we thinking about for deterrence, and then we can talk a little bit about implementation. So who are we integrating? We are integrating three cohorts inside the Department of Defense: the US government and our allies and partners, right? Three cohorts, three groups of folks. And each of those groups has a special obligation, has something to do, has a comparative advantage that we wanted to focus on. So inside the Department of Defense, what integrated deterrence means for us is that we are building a combat credible force. It is a force that can look across domains and across the spectrum of conflict. So look, there are these domains that, let's be honest, folks are not as comfortable with. Everyone's pretty comfortable with the maritime domain, right? We understand it, we can touch it, we know what it looks like. That's not still the case with other domains like cyber, for example. But for us to be effective, frankly, we have got to be able to look across these domains. We've got to be able to understand how and in what ways does that security environment, do those threats change, looking across those domains, and how do we together mobilize a response that's effective? So we have to look across domains. And the other piece I highlighted for the Department of Defense's job is to really be able to look across the spectrum of conflict. And this has been hard, frankly, right? We're pretty comfortable when we look at conventional conflict. We all understand it. And yet we know, and frankly, we have seen case studies, particularly of late, where we've seen adversaries, for example, who are comfortable engaging in hybrid warfare or even engaging in things like nuclear coercion. And so we have got to understand there is a spectrum here, and we have to understand how do you toggle across that, how do others toggle across that as well. So that first cohort, our job inside the Department of Defense for integrated deterrence is to have the ability to look across domains and across the spectrum of conflict in building a combat credible force. That next cohort, across the US government. We are so much more powerful when all of the departments and agencies are doing what they are best at, right? At playing to their comparative advantage. So we need our Treasury colleagues to be doing things like engaging in sanctions effort. We need our State Department colleagues to be engaging in that important diplomacy. We all need to be doing what we're best at because, frankly, there's opportunity costs and trade-offs when we're trying to do one another's jobs. And then that third cohort, our allies and our partners, this extraordinary, unparalleled network of allies and partners. When we work together, we can have such a powerful impact on that global security environment. And as I get to examples, I'll kind of walk through those. But as we all know, the US military does not go to war by itself. Indeed, we do not even win a revolutionary war by ourselves. Allies and partners are crucial and have been crucial from the very beginning of our country's founding. And we have seen example after example where we have been more powerful when we have worked with allies and partners. So, integration. You have those three cohorts inside the Department of Defense, across the US government, and our allies and partners. That's integration. Now let's turn to deterrence. What do I mean by deterrence? So look, the concept of deterrence is one that we're all pretty familiar with and have studied, and yet in the post 9/11 wars, our thinking on it has atrophied a bit, and that makes a lot of sense. When you're dealing with a threat like Al-Qaeda or a threat like ISIS, concepts like deterrence, frankly, just don't sing in the same way as when you are dealing with strategic competitors. So what we really want to do is bring the concept back and evolve our thinking on it. What that looks like is not just thinking about approaches to deterrence or logics of deterrence that we're most comfortable with, like deterrence by cost and position, right? So make it really painful for an adversary to achieve what it's trying to do, or deterrence by denial of benefits, precluding them from achieving what they're trying to do, but also maturing it to this idea of deterrence by resilience, so that effectively, as an adversary tries to take actions, those can bounce off of us, and we can escalate or de-escalate on our own terms. So there's a lot of good work and a lot of thinking to be done here. I see some young folks in the audience, and let me tell you, this is an area that is ripe for study, really thinking through how we will evolve our thinking on deterrence. So now, let's take it together. I told you integrated, I told you deterrence, let's bring it together. And for it to really work, we've got to have feedback loops. We've got to have ways to say, we did a bunch of things, how did that work? You know, Winston Churchill has this fabulous quote where he says, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally assess the results. And I think that quote is such a perfect way of understanding integrated deterrence. We are going to try to apply it. It is going to be our approach. I think we've seen some pretty good case studies, but we are going to need to constantly be learning. And when I say we, I mean all of those cohorts inside the department, across our interagency, and with our allies and partners. So let me just very briefly run through one case study, and then I look forward to taking your questions. And the case study that I'd like to talk about is the Indo-Pacific. That's not least because, as you might have recalled from my opening remarks, we are focused on this urgent need to sustain and strengthen deterrence with the People's Republic of China as our pacing challenge. All right, so what does integrated deterrence look like in the Indo-Pacific? What does it mean for those three cohorts? Well, inside the Department of Defense, I talked about how integrated deterrence means we've got to build a combat credible force. So you saw that we made a pitch for $773 billion to help build that combat credible force. And that included things like major investments in our Navy, major investments in space resilience, major investments in readiness, for example. So that need to build a combat credible force. Moreover, we also need to make sure that we're developing not just the capabilities, but also the concepts, right? And that we're thinking about things like force posture in new and different ways. Y'all might have seen that we had a submarine go into Diego Garcia not long ago. What an interesting example of showing how we can use the US military in different ways. So that's a little bit about what we can do inside the department. Across the interagency, and here I'd like to give a huge shout out to Congress. Y'all are no doubt familiar with the CHIPS Act, which Congress passed pretty recently. What a perfect example of showing how we need to reduce dependencies when we are dealing with challenges like the People's Republic of China. Because let's be honest, if this is our major geopolitical challenge going forward, it cannot just be a story of what the Department of Defense is doing. That simply will not be sufficient. And then let's turn to those allies and partners, right? That third cohort. Tomorrow, the Secretary of Defense is going to welcome two of his counterparts, the Ministers of Defense from Australia and the United Kingdom, because just last year, our heads of state announced this fantastic initiative called AUKUS. And with AUKUS, it involves working together on advanced capabilities and providing conventionally powered nuclear submarines to Australia, providing that capability to Australia. And that's been really important, both in terms of building capabilities among the cohort of those three countries, but also in working together and collaborating in key ways. There's other examples as well. In October, you might have seen there was a pretty notable exercise in the South China Sea where we had platforms from the United States, Australia, Japan, and Canada all working together in a complex maritime operation. And finally, I would just note, when we are looking at the Indo-Pacific and the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and the frame of allies and partners, that we're actually seeing some nice knitting together between our European allies and partners and our Indo-Pacific allies and partners. So at the last NATO summit, for example, the strategic concept, the updated strategic concept for how NATO thinks about challenges, talked about the People's Republic of China for the first time. That's a pretty big deal. You also might have seen at that summit that we had a number of our Asian allies also come and join it. So across the board, I think you see a bunch of examples where the Department of Defense, across the U.S. interagency, and with our allies and partners, has really been trying to realize this concept of integrated deterrence. All right, with that, let me stop and take your hard questions, and those can be on integrated deterrence, or frankly, any of the ideas and concepts in the National Defense Strategy. Yes, please, and I think there's a microphone right there so everyone can hear you. I get it. It happens to me often.
Ma'am, phenomenal talk. Greatly appreciate it. You brought up the idea of resiliency with integrated deterrence. And I think particularly with our allies and partners, considering some of their vulnerabilities is really important. So with our Philippine ally, with the sort of imminent loss of the Malampaya gas field as their energy sovereignty comes into question, what is it that we're looking to do to keep them whole so that we can better integrate with them and ensure that they are still a reliable partner going forward and don't become subject to Chinese predation with respect to energy?
No, I really appreciate that in your question, you took such a broad understanding of resiliency. And I think that's incredibly important. Because generally when I would get asked this question, I think it would be in much more of a military view, right? How do we think about things like the PRC mucking around in Philippine waters or what have you? And that wasn't the approach you took, and I think that's exactly right. You know, as the National Defense Strategy talks, there are these shocks to the system that we have to try to understand. Shocks like pandemics, shocks like climate change, that are quite literally going to shape the geography and the ecosystem that we are operating in. And so while we need to understand the defense element, we need to realize that things like energy predation, for example, can be playing a role in terms of pressure as well. And so what we need to do is, frankly, across our government, work with allies, the Philippines being a good example, to ensure that together they are ready and looking at alternatives. Frankly, when one is interested in issues like resilience, one has to be comfortable realizing that other topics that might seem adjacent to defense are actually really important. You know, I will give one spectacular example that I suspect will resonate with this crowd, and look at the issue of trying to get energy supplies across Afghanistan, right? Or Iraq, right? We lost blood, we lost treasure in trying to do that. And so if you can develop some sort of resilient approach to energy requirements, it actually has a pretty outsized effect. Please.
Peter Pennington, British Officers Club. In your opening statement, you mentioned the huge figure for the cost of all this, and you mentioned your 3 cohorts. Can I suggest there's a 4th cohort with inflation and possibly a recession? The 4th cohort's the American public. You lose them, we're all sunk.
I think there was a question in that, and so in saying that, I'm teasing. Look, the American public is fundamental to all of this, right? That's what we are doing, what we do. They are the ones who elect the members of Congress who decide if $773 billion is the right number, for example. It is on their behalf that civil servants and political appointees are trying to do all of this. You know, let me take a twist on what you were alluding to, which is how and in what ways do we have a conversation with the American public about these issues, about the People's Republic of China, about the challenges that we see posed by the People's Republic of China. And to harken back to something I was just talking about, the CHIPS Act, I actually think that that was a really nice example where members of Congress were able to help talk to their constituents and help them understand, here's what this means for you, and here's why this is notable. I might take another twist on what you are highlighting. We are obviously having this conversation as we are in the throes of the largest conflict in the European security theater in effectively any of our lifetimes. And I have been so struck by how the American public has had just tremendous support for our assistance to Ukraine, our very robust assistance to Ukraine, and for trying to pressure Russia to stop its unprovoked, terrible war of aggression on Ukraine. I think it's a good example of our public seeing what is happening, understanding what is right, and understanding why we need to support countries in maintaining their sovereignty.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. Going back to Admiral Daly's opening comments and referring to what the Commandant said, if deterrence is really the cornerstone, how are you measuring success? What you've talked about as your assessment or your case studies, you mentioned activities, but you didn't mention how you're measuring success. The Chinese fly into the Taiwan ADIZ all the time. They are pressing all the time. How do you measure the effectiveness of your conventional deterrence vis-a-vis China?
Thank you for that. It's a really hard question, and it's exactly the right question, and something that we are spending a lot of time and effort on, especially because, as I noted, we're really trying to get back to that concept of deterrence, one that, at least for the last 2 decades or so, has atrophied in our thinking in such a substantial way, for totally understandable reasons, to be very clear. Now, when you are looking at deterrence, if you want to be effective, you absolutely cannot say, I'm going to deter everything, right? That would be terribly astrategic, because you'd be throwing a bunch of resources at things that just might not work. I might say, so if that's what you want to avoid, for us to be effective, and of course I'm not going to speculate too much publicly about exactly what we are looking at, but for us to be most effective, we've got to be tailored and we've got to be deliberate, right? We've got to have very certain things that we are looking at to see, and I would say as we look at these things, they've got to be meaningful, right? Things that would have an impact on, say, our warfighting vulnerabilities or our warfighting advantages. And we've got to be able to say, is it that these sorts of efforts are occurring? And if so, what do we do to deter that? And is that we inside the department? Is it things that other parts of our interagency can do? Or is it things our allies and partners can do? So what we want to try to do to be effective and to get at this important and hard question you're highlighting is A, understand what is it a challenger adversary is trying to do, right? What are they trying to achieve? And then B, what is the impact of that on us, right? On particularly our sort of Department of Defense equities. And then C, how and in what ways are we going to try to reframe that? And so are they going to fly around the Indo-Pacific? Absolutely. What we need to understand is, what are they doing differently? How are they doing it? And what are the ways that we can help them understand that they need to take a responsible approach to their actions?
Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for a great introduction to today. I'm Lars Hedström from Swedish Defence University. I'm here with a team from Sweden and Finland, and we work together with National Defence University in a one-year project on Arctic and High North. And of course, we go from an integrated deterrence perspective. So please, can you give us your best advice how to approach this project?
The project on thinking about the High North, or?
Yes. From an integrated deterrence perspective.
Absolutely. So for integrated deterrence to work, what you're hearing from me is you've got to look holistically. You heard me just say in the answer to the last question, you've got to be tailored, right? What is it that matters? Countries are going to do things. They're going to do a lot of things. And if I just obsess over every one of those things, frankly, I'm going to waste time, attention, and resources in an ineffective way. That said, I've got to be able to take a holistic view. I talked about what that looks like across domains, but it's also important across regions as well. So if you went through the National Defense Strategy, you saw that the National Defense Strategy is pretty specific about what we are trying to deter and the sorts of conflicts we would need to prevail in if deterrence fails. And it talks about the People's Republic of China in the Indo-Pacific first and foremost, and then Russia in Europe. That doesn't mean, however, that we don't want to pay attention to what these sorts of challenges are doing across the board. Not least because they may be building some sort of advantages or creating vulnerabilities for us. And so frankly, this is one of the many, many reasons why we are lucky to have extraordinary allies and partners, Sweden being one spectacular example, of course, of that, and getting only more interesting as we speak, courtesy of Mr. Putin. And so helping us understand, I think, together, what are we seeing in the high north? How is that geography changing? How are we seeing, say, challengers like the People's Republic of China, threats like Russia, really starting to look at that geography differently and use that geography differently? And then we can start to look at exercises and activities so that we can really ensure that this is an area where we have serious security. So in particular, we're going to need to be continuing to work with you all to understand how and in what ways the situation is changing there, how others are understanding it. Remember, this is one of the great parts of having allies and partners. They have different perspectives. They get us out of our bubbles. They pierce our views in terms of what we are thinking and what we are understanding. And this is just another great case study of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today. My question kind of relates to your answer to the previous question. In terms of integration, how do we ask our allies to care about the same things when the risks are not always the same? So it's easy for us to ask Germany to not use Russian oil, but it's not our homes that are going to be cold this winter. So kind of how do you get all of the allies on the same page when the risks are disparate?
That's a fantastic question. You know, part of it is baselining how we understand risks and really taking that holistic perspective. Now, you were alluding a little bit to the example of Nord Stream 2 as you were looking at energy issues, and this is a topic, if you're familiar with, the conversations have been sporty over the last few years. Well, those conversations completely changed on February 24th, right? And they completely changed because folks across Europe, and in particular across Germany, saw that what they had diagnosed as one situation was actually completely different, and the risks that they were willing to take actually had to be completely reconceptualized. And we have seen some tremendous steps by various countries across Europe as they have decided to pivot, and frankly, these are hard things to do, right? They cost money, they impose kind of pain on a population, but in the long term are the right thing to do. So just to take Italy as one example, you know, before February 24th, before Putin launched this unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine, Italy had about a 40% dependence on Russian energy. Now it's down to about 15-20%. What a tremendous example of a leadership saying we need to do hard things. And we need to do hard things now because we see what we have purchased, right? We see what we have bought in this kind of agreement. So I would say part of it is really helping countries understand what those tentacles look like and what those risks will be. I think looking at 5G is another good example. It might feel somewhat innocuous, and yet if you spend a little time thinking about it, that's actually not the case at all. So it's imperative, I think, that we help countries understand what they are buying when they are not necessarily thinking through those immediate risks. And again, right now, I think looking at just the tremendous leadership across Europe in a willingness to kind of reconceptualize responses, it kind of spectacularly shows us what that looks like. So we've gotten a question from the UK earlier today, right? And we look at kind of the efforts of the UK in supporting Ukraine. We got a question from someone from Sweden. Talk about a game changer right there. The efforts of Sweden and Finland, of course, to join NATO. We see a bunch of examples across Europe of countries investing in their defense budgets, countries that were able to move their force posture around very quickly following the unprovoked aggression and invasion on February 24th. All that taken together shows that that folks are willing to take on costs and to reconceptualize risks as they understand that security environment changes. Let me offer just one final point here. I suspect many people here, lived through the 2014 Crimea invasion. And it has been so striking to see how different our understanding of what was going on, and of course our response to what was going on happened. And you know, it's such a striking reminder to me of why we have to be comfortable operating across that spectrum of conflict. Because we saw there the Russians operating masterfully across that spectrum of conflict and trying to change the geography of Europe. This has been a very different situation for obvious reasons, and I think you have seen that in terms of mobilization. But we really do need to be comfortable toggling across because, frankly, our challengers, our adversaries are doing so.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, Mallory Shelbourne with USNA News. A lot of the discourse we've heard surrounding the release of the recent NDAS for 2022 is downgrading the threat from Russia and really focusing on China as the pacing threat. And I'm wondering how, with this invasion of Ukraine and sending billions of dollars of aid there and so much of our attention there, how are you prioritizing ensuring that you're deterring in the Indo-Pacific, deterring China in that region, since that is the top priority according to the strategy?
So one of the big changes from the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was a really important start to really shift the Department of Defense from those post-9/11 wars to looking at strategic competitors, was the scaffolding, as you note, in terms of focusing on the PRC first, the People's Republic of China first, and then looking at Russia as an acute threat. And that was, frankly, because of the activities and the actions that we have seen from the People's Republic of China. We, sitting in 2022, saw a situation that looked different in 2018. Again, a strategy that was a very important start in making this shift. So as we were building this strategy throughout last year, we were, frankly, a little bit spoiled insofar as you no doubt know, we had Russia's playbook, right? So starting about last November or so, we had Russia's playbook. We saw what they were going to do, and so we were able to bake that into our thinking for how we were understanding the security environment, how we were going to understand our activities going forward in our strategy. So we termed Russia an acute threat, and we did that in the classified version, which we gave to Congress in March 2022 alongside our budget. You probably saw we put out a press release when that happened, and then, of course, in this unclassified version that you cite as well. And acute was chosen very deliberately. Acute was chosen because it's immediate and because it's sharp. And I think when we are looking at what's happening in Europe right now, we see that that is very much the case. Now, you are highlighting a really important point. How do we, frankly, walk and chew gum? How do we ensure that while we are focused, and I should say that focus on the People's Republic of China, that's not just a near-term story, it's not just a mid-term story, it's not just a long-term story, it's all of the above, right? It is all of those because it is a challenge that operates across those timeframes. So how do we do that while we are right now trying to ensure that we've got combat credible forces defending NATO and the ability to send billions of dollars of aid to support Ukraine with its asymmetric capabilities that we have seen manifest in extraordinary and spectacular ways. And there, in particular, the way that we are able to do that is to ensure that we are constantly thinking through the trade-offs, that we are constantly trying to understand what impact these will have on one another. We also understand that what happens in Ukraine is going to have an impact geopolitically. It is very hard for me to imagine that President Xi is not sitting in Beijing watching very, very closely and probably asking himself some very hard, awkward, and uncomfortable questions as well.
Thank you.
Hi, John Morton, member of the Naval Institute here. As we talk about partners and allies, how do you see India, with its huge potential, fitting in to this strategy? And what are you hoping to expect they're going to do in this superpower conflict with China?
India is a fantastic example. And when you look back all the way to President Bush's tenure, right? Summer 2005, President Bush and Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh together sign an agreement and together say, effectively, this is a strategic relationship, right? And I think from a US perspective, our view is this is a democracy, this is a power, this is only going to get, India's role in the Indo-Pacific and globally is only going to get more powerful. And that bet was exactly right. We have seen that manifest. And we have seen our relationship get closer and closer, whether it's through constructs like the Quad or whether it's through kind of activities and exercises that our militaries are doing. But frankly, this is a story that is so much bigger. than the military, right? You see it in terms of economic cooperation, et cetera. So I think this is an area that is just ripe with continued progress and opportunity. No doubt you have been following what the Indians have been engaged in over the last 2.5, 3 years or so, vis-a-vis the PRC. I think they are watching this and probably experiencing this challenge in a way that a lot of other countries are not, and probably have lessons learned from that, and it is probably shaping how they are understanding their role in the Indo-Pacific going forward. I think we have seen them increasingly play a responsible, productive, and important role in that security order regionally and globally, and us being knit together is only a good thing for realizing that progress.
Thank you very much for your comments. My name is John Kaskin, a retired Navy logistician. I alerted on your relating to the term of resilience as part of your strategy for deterrence. Now, I spent 30 years taking resilience out and creating efficiency because after the Cold War, we didn't think we needed resilience. And the industrial base has shrunk. Our ability, we never thought we were going to have a contested environment and attrition. We never thought we were going to have a protracted war. To rebuild all of those capabilities is going to require an immense investment. Do you see that the administration is going to try to get a larger percentage of the gross domestic product allocated to that, because it will take years to try to build up the munition stockpiles, generating the energy distribution that we'll need in the Pacific and so on, because it's an area that we really have taken a lot of capacity and capability out of, and it will require an immense amount of resources to rebuild.
Thank you. You're raising a superb point on the defense industrial base. And look, it's a point that has come up a bit in the last few years. The 2018 National Defense Strategy talked a little bit about it. The 2018 National Defense Strategy Congressional Commission talked a little bit about it. But frankly, I don't know that it had been internalized in the way that it needed to be before the events of these last 8-9 months with Russia's unprovoked aggression on Ukraine. And I think now it is very clearly in everyone's bloodstream. You see a tremendous amount of energy in looking at our defense industrial base and our need to invest in and really ensure that we can meaningfully invest in our munitions capabilities. So we are in, frankly, a very different ballgame now than I would have said a year ago. And I see that in our interactions, our very, very regular interactions with defense industry. I see it in our reconceptualization along the lines of what you are highlighting, and really in our need to figure out what is it that we can do to ensure this defense industrial base is as strong as it needs to be. Because those of us who are military historians can go back in history and see when there have been examples where we just needed to add a little water and suddenly we could surge. That's a whole lot harder when you are sitting here in 2022, which means we've got to lay the groundwork. And I would say that there's a lot of effort right now that's trying to make that happen, and it starts with that energy and that reconceptualization.
Thank you for being here. Am I on? Okay. This may be too detailed a question for this forum, but one of the questioners referred to the Philippines, and I will just say that in my lifetime, we now have a military presence in places I never would have thought of. Maybe there's just more news coverage. I don't know, and we're undoubtedly have people in many places in the world where we are not aware of it, but I'm thinking of Poland, for example. In the Indo-Pacific, where China, with apparent impunity, is establishing little islands or reefs or whatever it is, building them up, has there been thought given to opening or reopening a more established military presence in that part of the world? For example, Clark or Subic.
Thank you for that. So the U.S. military has this tremendous situation where allies and partners want to work with us, right? They want to collaborate with us, and many of them are not just comfortable with, but enthusiastic about us being based there, about having the U.S. military based there and operating in and out of there. I emphasize that not least because when you look at a threat like Russia, you look at a challenger like the People's Republic of China, that's not really the case, right? There's a reason that a decade ago, the People's Republic of China had to put so much effort into building islands, and that's clearly not something that we would need to do. So we are doing a lot of really serious work with our Indo-Pacific allies and our partners to look at our basing approach. Some of that involves looking at new bases. Some of that involves investing in bases that exist. And frankly, some of that involves looking at how and in what ways we're reconceptualizing exercises and activities and military construction so that we all, frankly, just get a lot more comfortable operating together. And we've seen some really good examples of this. Garuda Shield is a terrific exercise that happened not long ago. And this past round has been substantially bigger size, scale, and scope. So the number of folks participating, the number of countries participating, the sorts of engagements that happened across it. And so I would really take a kind of wide aperture in looking at what our engagement looks like, not just the pure vision of posture, which is forces, footprints, and agreements, but really all of the ways in which we are conducting activities and exercising with these allies and partners. You did note in particular that the president announced the establishment at the Madrid summit of the first permanent basing on the eastern flank in Poland with the 5th Corps. And I think that that's such a good example of how the US military, frankly, its secret sauce is that it can go anywhere at any time and operate across domains. It can operate across geography. So that really is a fantastic manifestation. When we look writ large, our ability to make these things happen is a great manifestation and realization of that national defense strategy. I'm getting the look. All right, I can do one final question. Thank you.
Bill Hamblett, I'm a retired Navy captain. I'm with the Naval Institute. At times in my career, I could see that it was more difficult perhaps to work with across the interagency. Our interagency partners could be more difficult than working with our military allies and partners. And integrated deterrence connotes an integration across the US government. And I'm curious how that's going and getting Treasury and state and USAID and other parts of the US government to view the world through a similar lens. And also, who is the integrator?
Thank you for that. So you hopefully read the National Security Strategy. And I'm obviously leaving y'all with a lot of homework if you haven't done it. And in the National Security Strategy, in fact, there's an entire page on integrated deterrence. And I highlight that to just emphasize it is clearly a concept that's animating us in the Department of Defense, but it's also a concept that is animating the entire US interagency. Now you bring up a really important point, which is in our history, and I might say particularly across the post 9/11 wars, we didn't always do that knitting together terribly well. Indeed, sometimes folks turned to the US Department of Defense and said, you all go do that thing. Even though you're actually not terribly good at that thing, you don't necessarily have the resources to do that thing, and indeed there's an opportunity cost if you do that thing. But as we all know, the Department of Defense's answer is often, got it, you tell us to go do a thing, we're gonna do a thing. But at the end of the day, we're just a whole lot more effective when we play to our comparative advantages. So I have actually witnessed, frankly, the most spectacular case study of knitting together across the interagency, and that has been the response to Russia's war on Ukraine. Now, as I noted earlier, it was helped by the fact that we had Russia's playbook come last year, right? And because of that, we were very able to quickly, and this is different than what we saw in the 2014 Crimea invasion, we were able to quickly, across the interagency, diagnose what was happening and then focus on prescription. And so we've done that knitting together in spectacular ways. We've been able to develop an understanding of what's happening, been able to develop a really good battle rhythm, and then of taking activities. And so you have seen, I think, across this war, a bunch of kind of examples of this happening. Efforts by our State Department colleagues, efforts by our Treasury colleagues, for example, and of course, kind of efforts by the US Department of Defense. So in my mind, this is a spectacular example of showing, and frankly, it has had a strategic impact, that if you can get the US interagency to knit together in a timely manner, we can have a serious impact on a threat. Now, I think what will be most important is ensuring that that becomes a part of our battle rhythm as we're dealing with other challenges and threats. But I'm heartened, frankly, by seeing this example, by knowing that despite some case studies perhaps in the past where it didn't go so hot, that actually we can make this happen. I am getting the sign to get off the stage. Thanks you all so much for spending your morning with me.
Thank you, Dr. Carlin. We really appreciate the deep knowledge and passion that you bring to this topic. I'm going to depart with precedent and just ask one question. Before you leave, I think it would be bad if we didn't ask this question. It's pretty clear that if we're reacting to something, that we're going to get the interagency together. But this seems to imply a preemptive, thoughtful approach ahead of reaction. And I was wondering if you could just leave us with a picture of what does this look like every day? Is there like a room full of people who are working policy papers across the agencies? And I don't want to make it sound too bureaucratic, but where's the look ahead piece of this? Because I think you've given terrific examples of reacting to events. If you could give us 30 more seconds on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, the national security strategy really tried to outline our need to not just deal with the challenges of today, but going forward. There's this great term in it, the decisive decade, and it's saying we've got to figure out some really hard things in this period of time. And so I can assure you there is a ton of effort that is occurring every day, really led by the White House to ensure that that becomes a reality. Because frankly, the challenges that we have talked about today, most notably dealing with the People's Republic of China, we're only going to successfully get after those if we are going to be knit together. I can assure you that effort is happening in both understanding what's happening, how and in what ways is it changing, and above all, what is it that we as a U.S. government are doing to try to tackle that, working with our closest allies and partners.
Well, thank you. And I want to give you a gift. It doesn't near account for your time, which we know is precious, but a gift of a Naval Institute Press book, War Transformed by Mick Ryan. Mm-hmm. And let's give Dr. Carlin one more hand, please.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so excited. Thanks. Fantastic. I can't wait to read this.
Thanks so much. Good luck with the day. Okay. So our next speaker, who I'll introduce, is Brigadier General Kyle Ellison. And General Ellison is the Commanding General of the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab and the Futures Directorate. He's also the Vice Chief of Naval Research. Prior to assuming his current role, General Ellison served as the Commanding General, 3rd Marine Brigade, and Deputy Commanding General of the 3rd MEF from July 2020 to July 2022. We wanted to get an operator's perspective on this. How does this translate down to the practitioners on the military side? And General Ellison is just the right person to speak to implementing integrated deterrence, given his recent tours and operational experience in the Indo-Pacific. So we thank him for being here today, and let's give General Ellison a big welcome.
Thanks for having me today. Okay, I think the mic is hot, I think. Are we good? Okay. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and what an honor it is to be here. And I'd first like to thank you, Vice Admiral Daly, and the entire U.S. Naval Institute for inviting me to speak here today, and for providing me the opportunity to address such an experienced and thoughtful audience on the important topic of integrated deterrence. And I feel like I should be sitting in the audience listening to some of you. So yes, it's truly an honor for me to be here, and thank you, sir. I'd like to begin with a brief introduction, if I may, to the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. At the lab, we are laser focused on improving Marine Corps capabilities in support of naval expeditionary warfare across the spectrum of conflict. We develop concepts, we wargame these concepts, and continuously refine those concepts through experimentation and exercises, rapid experimentation at the speed of a changing strategic context. We also work in close partnership with the Office of Naval Research, DoD labs and research centers, as well as the industry and academia to identify, develop, and deliver cutting-edge technologies for warfighter assessment and experimentation. And we do all of this by, with, and through the Fleet Marine Force. And this methodology facilitates rapid feedback, iteration, and refinement. And most importantly, everything we do at the lab is threat-informed and geared toward establishing enduring advantages that both enable and are enabled by the Naval and Joint Force. Before McWill, as was previously noted, I served as the CG 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade and the Deputy Commanding General 3 Marine Expeditionary Force in Okinawa, Japan. In those roles, I gained an even greater appreciation and understanding of the Pacific AOR, our pacing threat, and daily operations, activities, and investments that are advancing collective security and integrated deterrence now. Moreover, my engagements with allies and partners was constant. Our allies feel the threat and recognize the consequences of failing to act. And our adversaries recognize the true power of our collective resolve. As we speak, the Joint Force lives and breathes the deterrent effort. Marine Corps efforts contribute to the 3 deterrent logics of denial, resilience, and collective cost imposition as outlined in the National Defense Strategy. So, how does the Marine Corps fit into the integrated deterrence equation, and what is the impact we will have across the deterrence logics? I contend that these logics are embedded in everything that the Marine Corps is either already doing today or is preparing to do tomorrow. Simply put, the Marine Corps is uniquely positioned and will be well equipped as we realize the full Force Design 2030 transformation to contribute to a joint, combined, and whole-of-government approach to integrated deterrence. A year ago, the Marine Corps released a concept for stand-in forces. Integrated deterrence is strengthened through the application of this concept. Dependent upon the situation, stand-in forces could be made up of elements of the Marine Corps, Navy, Special Operations Forces, and select elements of the broader Joint Force. Stand-in forces also integrate with the Interagency, our allies, and partners. Bottom line, when Marines are acting as part of stand-in forces, we will be positioned forward, shoulder to shoulder with our allies and partners, leveraging all domain tools as the eyes and ears of the Fleet Marine Force and the Joint Force writ large. In fact, we are conducting the counter-reconnaissance and reconnaissance fight time now. A stand-in force acts as an enabler for a larger joint force and buys time for decision makers. This nimble yet lethal force will be in best position to deny an adversary the ability to gain an advantage or the ability to reach their objectives quickly. These forces present a persistent forward presence during day-to-day operations so that they are positioned to quickly respond to a developing situation without having to fight for access. Stand-in forces will deny adversary freedom of maneuver and access to key maritime terrain, and our forward presence afloat will ensure we always win that race to that terrain. By integrating sensors and all domain effects, our forces contribute to closing kill webs, enabling the Joint Force with redundant data pathways, resilient communications, sensing, and additional lethality. After all, combined arms is multi-domain and multi-axis. This approach is only effective when we achieve common networks and communications to drive all-domain, joint, partnered, allied integration and interoperability. We are moving in that direction now and actively experimenting to this end. Recently, the Marine Corps participated in Project Convergence 2022, an experiment that brought together approximately 300 technologies, including long-range fires, unmanned aerial systems, autonomous fighting vehicles, and next-generation sensors with the goal of advancing joint and multinational interoperability in future operational environments. A combined network of sensors, shooters, and enablers will enhance the joint forces' ability to hold the key adversaries at risk, deny them their goals, and defeat them if necessary. I had a chance to view some of these experiments firsthand, and ladies and gentlemen, we are moving the needle, and we are constantly improving our joint and coalition interoperability and integration. However, critically important to and of deterrent value is our ability to follow through with these lessons learned, closing seams and gaps across the joint and partnered forces. This is happening now and will continue to happen in the future as we experiment forward in exercises in the Indo-Pacific region. Now I'd like to shift briefly to the second logic, deterrence by resilience. Our competitors have put a significant effort into denying what has been one of the United States' greatest strengths since World War II, the ability to project combat power over time, worldwide, and in uncontested, and then sustain it. Anti-axis aerial denial capabilities are increasingly challenging this strength and are creating standoff areas and protected bubbles in the littorals. Stand-in forces, however, will thrive in this high-threat environment. They are survivable and resilient by remaining nimble, moving often, and avoiding enemy intelligence collection efforts. We are reducing our sustainment burdens and maximizing maneuverability, in part by reducing logistics demands across the life cycle of the stand-in forces. This will increase their survivability, persistence, and give them a position of a strength and advantage. In coordination with our allies and partners, so think organic air and surface mobility, pre-positioned stocks of munitions and logistics, fuel parts, and etc. This persistent presence of our stand-in force, combined with our network of forward bases and stations, will provide a sustained and credible security guarantee for our allies and partners, thereby empowering them to resist the pervasive coercion techniques of our competitors. A subject that deserves more attention in any discussion on deterrence is the value of strategic basing. Strategic basing is one of the most critical aspects of the deterrent efforts, in my opinion. While we modernize our power projection capabilities, we must not lose focus on broadening our stance in the Pacific or hardening our forward installations. Perhaps more than anything else, our forward forces, bases, and stations are the greatest reflection of our enduring commitment and resolve. They are a powerful display of our pledge to defend the interest and sovereignty of our allies and our partners. Nothing exemplifies commitment more than the tens of thousands of American service members, civil servants, contractors, and their families forward deployed right now. They are thriving and living aboard our advanced bases and within their partnered nations' local communities. These locations are where integration of the integrated deterrence begins, and it begins with our allies and partners. The intertwining of posture and activities that take place at our forward bases is absolutely critical, which has the effect of strategic hardening. Strategic hardening, as defined by a good friend of mine, Major General Bill Bowers, who is the former Commanding General of the Marine Corps Installations Command Pacific, is, and I quote, any action that further complicates adversary targeting and engagement decisions through a formal treaty, alliances, military and civil co-use activities, and socio-cultural activities. An example of this would be an air base, such as Marine Corps Air Base Iwakuni, where U.S., Japan Self-Defense Forces, and civilian airlines operate from the same piece of terrain. Potential adversaries must pause to contemplate this fact. Any form of aggression will be against not one, but rather two or many. The value of our overseas bases cannot be overstated, and our investment in the resilience of these locations will have far-reaching impacts on our ability to deter. Our very presence projects a clear message of reassurance. The message to our allies and partners is this: we have skin in the game. We're not leaving. We are all in because we have shared values and common interests. the U.S. Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral Aquilino maintains that deterrence requires positioning and persistent presence of combat-credible forces and capabilities. This implies a joint force that is persistently positioned, present, forward, innovating, integrating, and operating with our closest allies and partners to improve our collective warfighting advantage over any potential adversary. There is no stronger message than a U.S. Marine Corps F-35 Bravo landing on a Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force carrier to refuel, something our adversaries cannot do. While I served in 3MEF, I witnessed these efforts every day. The Marines in 3MEF are integrated with the Joint Force and our key allies and partners during multilateral exercises, training events, and key leader engagements. Exercise Bala-Katan and the recently executed Keen Sword are just two examples of this integration. The 2022 iteration of Bala-Katan was a Philippine-led joint and combined exercise consisting of Australian Self-Defense Force personnel and about 9,000 members of the U.S. military and Philippine Marine Corps, Navy, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Special Operations Forces. The main Marine Corps component for Bala-Katan was the 3rd Marine Division and the 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment, which demonstrated how fast and how far the Marine Corps has come in its modernization efforts, transferring the mantle of a multilateral joint service exercise to a new Marine Corps unit formation, 3rd MLR. This exercise and others highlight our deeply rooted partnership and demonstrates to the world that our warfighting advancements and technological breakthroughs are compatible with our closest allies and partners. Moreover, Exercise Keen Sword in the Southwest Islands focused on interoperability and integration. The joint force working side by side with the Japan Self-Defense Force in the Southern Ryukyus. Similarly, MAR-4 PAC's Marine Rotational Forces Darwin and Marine Rotational Force Southwest Asia series of deployments demonstrates another enduring integration effort. These Marine Air-Ground Task Force deployments to Australia and beyond help mature the theater logistically, enhance regional security, strengthen alliances, and position us to rapidly respond to crises and contingencies, not alone, but as an integrated and cohesive coalition. Lastly, I'll touch on the third logic of deterrence by direct and collective cost imposition. Simply put, standing forces will hold an adversary at risk throughout the spectrum of conflict. Through reconnaissance, standing forces will support detection and expose the adversary's coercive behavior or malign activities. The benefit of this is twofold. First, it is deterrence by detection. In other words, it demonstrates to the adversary that we are here and we see you. Secondly, if deterrence fails, reconnaissance will bolster the combined forces' common operational picture, enabling rapid strike at a time of our choosing to seize the initiative. Standing forces consistently impact the adversary's decision calculus while enabling the rapid introduction of joint and combined forces. So we've discussed quite a bit here about what we are changing in the Marine Corps, but I'd like to briefly touch on what we are not changing and what our enduring roles will be. Though the Corps is evolving at speed to meet the future threat, the Marine Corps will not stray from our crisis response roots or our responsibility as the nation's expeditionary force in readiness. To execute this, we will remain positioned forward to respond to crisis or conflict on a global scale. The Navy and Marine Corps team has maintained a 2.0 ARGMU presence in the Pacific theater for the last 2 years, providing operational reach and campaigning alongside our allies and partners. The Noble Fusion exercise in the Pacific of last year is just one example. 10,000 joint and allied forces conducting operations at sea, in the littorals, across all domains, demonstrating we can and will win any race for key maritime terrain. From disaster relief to combat operations, our forward deployed amphibious forces are continuously postured and prepared to meet the strategic demands of forward presence, crisis response, power projection, and theater security cooperation. Their very presence serves as a deterrent and a powerful message of reassurance, and we must not lose our amphibious capability. So recognizing the enduring value proposition that forward and ready amphibious forces bring to the integrated deterrence equation, we are developing a new concept for 21st century amphib operations. This naval concept will provide the conceptual framework for conducting amphibious operations in the 21st century and will place a special focus on incorporating innovative ways to overcome emerging capabilities. It makes the assumption that the anti-axis aerial denial capabilities will be proliferated globally and center on key maritime terrain. And as a result, we complement traditional amphibious capabilities with more agile platforms. We will incorporate artificial intelligence and unmanned systems capable of traveling long distance to penetrate the threat ring and in dispersed formations to complicate the decision-making calculus and targeting capabilities of an adversary. We will leverage disruptive technologies, and most importantly, with the joint force, our allies and our partners, we will maintain the global commons. So in closing, integrated deterrence is simple in concept, yet is extremely difficult in execution, and the Marine Corps is doubling down on our capabilities. We're innovating, experimenting at pace, and therefore strengthening our contribution to integrated deterrence in the Pacific and around the globe. And on the off chance that deterrent fails, our Marines, your Marines, will do what they've always done, and that's fight and win. So with that, if we could flip the slide, please. Listen, I'm going to come off script just a bit and tell you I put this picture up for a reason. Every day I look at it. It's in my office, and it's on my home desk. And I put it up, this is Marja 2010, to remind me that every decision we make, every strategy that is made, every policy that is delivered and issued has to be implemented by someone. And you could put soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, special operators on this same slide. But these men and women are the ones that have to execute the strategies that we create. And if deterrence fails, we better give them the capability and capacity to do what we're asking them to do. And that's the fight and win part I talked about at the very end. So these issues are passionate for me because of those that are on the pointy end of the spear every single day. And so, sir, thank you very much. I think we have some time for some questions, but it's really an honor to be here amongst all of you. So if we can change the slide, please.
Thank you very much. I'll ask the first question, if I may. Again, Pete Daly, CEO and publisher. It seems to me, first, that one of the most interesting parts of doing planning, which the Marine Corps planning process is highly respected, is this idea that's captured in the CJCS ROE, where if you don't have the ROE you need, the final line is, if you don't have the ROE you need, ask for it. With the onset of integrated deterrence, General, do you foresee a different aspect to the planning process where a military commander can ask for something outside the military realm that would help him with tasks like denial and cost imposition as part of the planning process? Is this something being discussed either at the warfighting lab or at MCCITIC in the circles that you're in?
Thank you, sir, for that question. And perhaps I answer it in two ways. One, I think speaking in the Pacific, in the first island, for example, distributing the force early, left of a transition from crisis to conflict, is going to require engagement now. And access, early access, before the first round, or left of bang, in other words, will be absolutely critical. And that's not done with the military alone. It's not done by Admiral Aquilino alone. It's done from an interagency perspective and with those host nation governments and the relationships we build every day. So we better be concerned now with the speed of deployment so we can be employed at the right time and the right place. and that is outside in many ways the span of control and the decision calculus, or correction, the decision authorities of the operational and tactical commanders forward. But it's in planning. The requirements are built. We know where we need to go and when we need to go, and now we just need to continue to shape and set conditions now to be able to do it as we transition from crisis to conflict. The second point I'll simply make, it has to do with permissions and authorities, and without getting outside my lane here. My view on centralization and decentralization and the control of the escalation ladder is really going to be important for our operational commanders to understand and our tactical commanders to recognize. So I believe that as we go from competition to crisis, we will have more centralization from a permissions and authorities perspective on things like non-lethal fires. Why? Because we want to de-escalate the situation, and that's going to require thoughtful decisions at the highest level to ensure that we understand the second, third, and fourth order effects of our decisions. But as we transition from crisis to conflict, where I feel we're most vulnerable, I think we'll find a more decentralized approach to the fighting. And that'll be a necessity, I think, in order to win and gain an advantage because of the scale and the complexity of what we're going to be up against in the Pacific. If that answers your question, Admiral.
It does. Thank you.
Good morning, General. Mike Brogan, I'm a Marine, no longer in uniform.
Good to see you.
So full disclosure, acquisition professional. And though I recognize that your partner at CDD writes the requirements, designing for export, as we've seen, we're the arsenal of democracy again, has to begin in the technology development. What are you and your folks at McWill, as well as Naval Research, doing to communicate to industry the need to think about exportability as they design systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, sir. I think that first and foremost, we have to continue to partner with industry or we'll lose. I think that is a clear statement coming out of your own question, I think. Number two, I also feel we have to have unity of effort across our S&T initiatives. We can put a lot of things out there, but if we can't grow it and we can't get it to the capacity we need to get it to, and we can't get it to the warfighters to train and use to develop TTPs, then our S&T efforts are ineffective. And so I also feel that we're going to be fighting perhaps with some experimental technologies just by the nature of our system, our acquisition systems. That's okay if we can get them to scale and we can get them out there sooner than later and we can train on them. And so I kind of look at, if you ask me what my battlefield framework is, it's kind of close, deep, and deeper, right? So close is very threat-informed, as I said in my comments. It is, when does the adversary, our pacing threat, get to a capability and capacity level where they may decide to do something? Intent aside, right? And that is my priority, the close fight from a technological perspective, and making sure that we can scale up with the right technologies at the right time and place. And then deep is getting us through our condition-based force design efforts, and the Commandant has clearly stated it's a journey, not a destination. So we're going to have to continue to learn, but we have certain objectives in the Marine Corps that we need to meet to be able to say that we're meeting the conditions of force design in our transformation. And then the deeper is out there. 3 FIDIPs out, disruptive technologies, being the headlights from a technological perspective for the Marine Corps, also in concepts and plans. So we don't have to, so we can be looking at what the next force design looks like now, based on evolving security challenges and actually what we're learning about force design time now. So technologies there are a lot of technologies being pushed out to the fleet right this moment, from ONR, from DARPA, from you name it. So what we've tried to do at McWill, and we're almost there, is creating an S&T fusion center. And I am the executive agent for the Marine Corps for Science and Technology. And so what is most important is our engagement with industry is unified in our efforts and that priorities are clearly defined so there can be some level of decentralization in going after these technologies and then bringing it back in, feeding it to the warfighter by, with, and through the fleet so we can experiment with those technologies and ensure they're the right ones we need and want. It's all about trading space for time right now, I think, in other words. I don't know if that makes sense, sir, but we're attacking it. And I think what's critical is fusing all these efforts for the close fight and making sure that we're giving the warfighter what they need now. So an example would be these technologies out at Pacific, or at Project Convergence 22 that we just executed. They're critically important to our contributions to joint and coalition kill webs. Now we're going to take the lessons learned and we're going to put them into 3 other Indo-PACOM exercises over the next year to continue to refine and learn at the same time as identifying what's the scale and capacity I need for those different technologies and then feeding it back to CDD. The Fusion Center, for example, that we're developing in McWill, will have CDD requirements writers sitting right next to our S&T folks. Why is that important? It's important, sir, you know much better than I do, for a lot of reasons, but first and foremost, some of these technologies we're developing are at higher classification levels where some of the requirements writers don't have the clearances to write. And so right out of the gate, we're behind the power curve. So by bringing the right folks, sitting them in the same room together, understanding how those requirements feed our warfighting concepts, and then enabling more rapid, more accurate transition may get us across the valley of death, in some cases faster, if that makes sense, sir. It's a great question. I hope I came close to answering it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good morning. Megan Eckstein with Defense News. I wanted to ask you about the new concept for 21st century amphibious operations. First, I just wondered if you had a timeline for drafting that and starting to implement it. But second, on the disruptive technologies piece, the Marines have been able to move pretty quickly on things like Nemesis, where it's fully within the Marines' control to improve upon existing programs. Moved a little bit slower on things like light amphib, where you've had to bring in the Navy and take kind of a traditional acquisition approach. And I just wonder, given those lessons learned already from force design, how are you going to approach any new technologies that you need for this new concept?
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for that question. Let's start with the 21st century amphib question. First of all, we're on track. We're currently drafting right now the concept, but we're not doing it by ourselves. This is I don't know if you picked it up in my comments. It's naval. It's not Navy or Marine Corps. It's not a Marine Corps 21st century concept. So therefore, our process is working right alongside with our partners in Fleet Forces Command and elsewhere to write this concept. It also entails staffing it out to the warfighters to understand what they're learning every day forward. So our timeline is condition-based, not time-based, quite frankly. We want to get it right. But it is a concept. It doesn't mean it's the answer to 21st century amphibs. But it's also about learning about our force design efforts now to include our research and development on new technologies and etc. Better feed that. It has to feed that. We have to be working with offices like the Net Assessment and the Marine Corps' assessment team that actually focuses on alternate futures, the deeper part of that battle space framework that I'm talking about. So we're going to take our time on it and make sure we get it right. But we're well on path and on glide slope to getting it towards completion here with our partners, the Naval Force, and up for review and signature. And ma'am, your second question?
Oh, just on the disruptive technologies and how to get after those quickly.
I think it's number one. I'll start by saying this. We don't have a choice but to get after it quickly. And that's the first thing. And if you think of from a threat-based perspective, it's not good enough to be sequential in our processes anymore. To wait to we get a technology, wait for a while, experiment with it, war game with it, do these things, and then finally get it out to the operating forces in the fleet. Number one, the fleet are the best people to teach us about new technologies and how they would best be used. That's why we experiment often by, with, and through the fleet. But what we really need to do is incorporate new technologies into every exercise that we have going on now, experimenting forward with these new technologies. And quite frankly, I think sometimes experimentation forward has deterrent value. And so we just have to experiment with the right things at the right time and the right place forward. And then one thing that we have to really make sure we do is there's a lot of experimentation going on with technologies. So you may take ONR, for example, that may go and experiment with CLB-8, Combat Logistics Battalion 8 down at Camp Lejeune on technologies that enable sustaining the force in a contested environment. But the real question is are we capturing all the lessons learned that then feed back into programs? So as we experiment with multiple technologies out there, disruptive is good at times, it's also bad. It's also bad if it creates disunity instead of unity. And then it could slow down our process to turning the right technologies into programs of record and getting them at the right capacity to the warfighter. Does that make sense, ma'am? So we're not hesitating to experiment in the Marine Corps. Matter of fact, we think that's one of our greatest strengths right now, is that we're forward, we're doing things, we're innovating, and now we just need to make sure we get the right things to the warfighter at the right capacity.
Great.
And we're going to keep doing it.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, General,
ma'am.
for very valuable information that I learned today. Veronica Cartier, I'm a member of Naval Institute. I have a short comment and a question, operational question. My comment is that China is not only American challenge, it has become the world challenge. And on the operational question is that lately has been written, winning without smoking gun. And I think that it has been China characteristic of war, which is, seem like nothing happened, winning, but backstabbing. So I would like to get your perspective in the kinetic fight with the ecosystem warfare, which is we needed with the modern technology that you implemented, the OD implemented, such as LAW, that is the latest that you program it for the light submarine warfare.
The amphibious warship, ma'am?
Yes,
Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
that's the right word. And that's how it is then the connectivity or the annexation between the kinetic fight and the ecosystem warfare.
Okay. Maybe I say it this way. Maybe we talk in the context of the nature of war and the character of war, and focus very heavily towards the Pacific, if that's all right, ma'am, if I answer it.
Yes, it's Indo-Pacific, sure.
So I think, number one, the nature of war is that slide I put up, and I don't think the nature of war is going to change. I will tell you, ma'am, that my feeling on it, and these are my personal feelings on it, if we went to war with the pacing threat, it will be warfare that we haven't seen at that level, that scale, and that complexity since World War II. And then you add the new technologies and the changing character of war, and it'll be challenging. It'll be in many ways Sir Neptune's Inferno-like at times in the maritime domain. And it'll be critically important that we are not attritionist in our thinking, we're maneuverist in our thinking, that we look for strengths and weaknesses within our adversaries, which from a Marine Corps perspective, that's our warfighting philosophy, being maneuverist. But we need to look at ways that we don't try to compete with magazine depths, for example, that we look for opportunities to exploit weaknesses that our adversaries present. And that requires us today, as a joint force, to be conducting that reconnaissance and that reconnaissance forward inside the West and around the globe, understanding and learning about our adversaries' strengths and weaknesses. They are not 10 feet tall, and they do have weaknesses. And so as we develop the force and as we continue to learn and we evolve with the changing character of war, keeping in mind the nature of war is enduring, that we evolve our forces in a way that deter first, and if deterrence fails, win. And I'll close with this, if I may, sir. I've been in the Marine Corps almost 30 years, not as long as some of my good friends that are sitting out here today. But I will tell you, when I grew up in the Marine Corps, and I still believe this in some ways, is it was just give us battle space, just give the Marine Corps space. We're a MAGTF. We have an air combat element, a ground combat element, and a logistics combat element. Give us the space. If you want to give us more combat power, we'll take it, and we'll fight it, right? We had that capability in a very lineal fight. That still applies. The single battle-like concept still applies. However, now we're talking over vast distances, non-contiguous terrain, maritime, all-domain battle space. So how do we gain and maintain not a Marine Corps single battle, and by definition of a single battle, actions in one part of the battlefield impact actions everywhere? What is the naval and joint single battle? And then add our coalition forces in there. That is deterrence, and that'll make us a more credible force if we had to go from crisis to conflict. So understanding that joint, partnered and allied single battle will be critical. I hope I got close to answering your question, ma'am.
Yes, it's very good. And I know, thank you so much for concentrating in Indo-Pacific, which is my concentration, geopolitical concentration. Thank you so much, General.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, General Ellison. You're working a very large, complex, and non-linear problem. And we really respect the fact that you gave us your time and your thoughts today. We super appreciate it. And I want to give you this book, War Transformed, by Mick Ryan, Naval Institute Press. It doesn't account for the time that you gave us, but we thank you. And let's give General Ellison one more hand, please.
Thank you, Admiral. I hope I met your intent.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
It was great. Thanks. Okay, we're going to take a short break. We're about 5 minutes behind, so we'll take a short break and come back at 10:35 promptly, and we'll be ready to go. Thank you. Okay, I think we got everybody. The Naval Institute launched the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project over the summer, and through a series of focused articles and the pages of proceedings, we're mining maritime strategy elements from various authors and examining and exploring the concept of how the United States and its allies can effectively implement counterinsurgency in the South China Sea. Maritime COIN is aimed directly at operationalizing integrated deterrence through campaigning short of war. Hunter Stiers is the project director. We're very happy to have him here today, and he's been great working with our team at the Naval Institute on the counterinsurgency project. He's a fellow with the Naval War College's John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research. He's been recognized twice in the U.S. Naval Institute's General Prize Essay Contest, which is quite something. His first prize-winning entry, The South China Sea Needs a Coin Toss, was published in the May 2019 issue and was the impetus for this whole project, the counterinsurgency project. Hunter will lead a conversation with Brent Sadler and Peter Schwartz. We're very glad they're here today, and he will introduce them on the topic of maritime counterinsurgency in the South China Sea, integrated deterrence in action. So I welcome Hunter, Brent, and Peter, and thank you. And Hunter, over to you. Look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Admiral Daly, for that very kind and generous introduction. To set the stage for our conversation today, when we think about China, what tends to grab the headlines and most of the attention are a couple of big-ticket items. We hear a lot about China's development of anti-access and area denial capabilities, and we hear a lot about its burgeoning conventional naval forces, particularly in the realm of capital ships like carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. What we generally don't hear a lot about is China's forcible coercion of local civilian mariners in Southeast Asia. It bears repeating that fully half the world's fishing fleet operates in the South China Sea, and more than 3.7 million people depend on access to the South China Sea for their daily livelihoods. And this large civilian population is being subjected to a concerted campaign of intimidation and harassment. Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia forces will steal fishermen's catch. They confiscate radios and navigational equipment that is essential to the safe operation of small craft in an expansive and busy waterway. Chinese forces will pour gasoline into civilians' drinking water supplies to compel them to return to shore. Chinese forces will kidnap Vietnamese fishermen for ransom. China has threatened to openly attack Southeast Asian countries on multiple occasions for daring to pursue energy development in their own national EEZs. And let's not forget that Chinese forces will fire upon, ram, and sink civilian vessels, often leaving their crews in the water to drown, an outrageous desecration of the most foundational rule governing conduct among mariners. Regardless of whether China's systematic maritime barbarism constitutes a form of state piracy, its strategic objective is clear. China seeks to undermine and ultimately overturn the prevailing regime of international law that upholds the freedom of the sea, a foundational U.S. national interest for which this country has gone to war no less than 6 times. This is an objective of truly world historical importance. To realize its revisionist aims, China does not fight conventionally with the U.S. Navy and its partners. Instead, China circumvents them in the gray zone to cumulatively and coercively impose its will directly on the civilians who dwell in the places that Beijing wants to make its own. We have a name for this kind of strategy. It's called an insurgency. This one just so happens to be a maritime insurgency. It is essential to understand that China is waging a dual-track strategy. They are preparing for possible future war, and they are working overtime to win without fighting through maritime insurgency today. We do not have the luxury of choosing our preferred threat. The uncomfortable truth is that if we do not solve the problem of China's maritime insurgency today, we won't need to worry about a big war, because we will wake up one day and find that they will have won and we will have lost with not so much as a shot fired. Even without losing a big war, if we do not take action to stop China's maritime insurgency now, we will be living in China's world. So, to prevent this dark outcome, it is imperative that the U.S. Sea Services and our partners and allies mobilize our intellectual capital to develop and operationalize an actionable strategy of maritime counterinsurgency, positioning our forces to protect and empower civilians as they exercise their rights under the free and open international legal regime that we seek to uphold. Enter the U.S. Naval Institute's Maritime Counterinsurgency Project. Made possible through a visionary grant by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project brings together the world's preeminent maritime strategists to formulate, in the open and in real time, a cohesive new approach for the United States and its allies to counter China's illegal activities to dominate the entire South China Sea. The project launch is the July 2022 issue of Proceedings. It expanded the book to make room for this vital discussion. And we've got new articles coming out in print and online all the time. We've got the December issue features 2 fantastic articles by Phil Pornell and Leslie Wilhelm. He was here in the audience. And today, it is my great honor to introduce 2 of our most illustrious contributors, Captain Brent Sadler and Captain Peter Schwartz. Captain Brent Sadler is Senior Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology at the Heritage Foundation. While in uniform, his counsel was sought by combatant commanders at Indo-Pacific Command, multiple chiefs of naval operations, and indeed presidents. While he was supporting the National Security Council, Captain Sadler played a key role in defining what the Obama administration's pivot to Asia would look like. And Captain Peter Schwartz needs no introduction, but indeed deserves one. Captain Schwartz is adjunct principal research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses. He served 2 tours in the Vietnam War as an advisor to the South Vietnamese Navy, and he served on the staff of Admiral Bud Zumwalt. Subsequent to his Vietnam service, he served on the staffs of successive chiefs of naval operations, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, and indeed Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell. Captain Schwartz played a leading role in conceptualizing and drafting the Navy's maritime strategy of the 1980s, which has been credited by some with delivering the American victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And indeed, he was one of the key architects of the seminal January 1986 issue of Proceedings on the Maritime Strategy, which has been a major inspiration of the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project. And I'm profoundly grateful to Captain Schwartz for the hours that he spent on the phone with me during the planning phases of the Maritime Coin Project, sharing his wisdom on how exactly does one go about putting together an expanded issue of Proceedings on a topic of this nature. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Captain Sadler. We're going to have prepared remarks by both of our panels, and then we'll move into a discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you very much. Captain Sadler, fire the first broadside.
All right, thank you. There's a few slides. I'm a nukes, so these are meant to keep me on topic and also on schedule. So the key thing, the observation from the comments earlier today is there was not enough time spent on the proactiveness of integrated deterrence. And hopefully I'll give some insight on what that is and could look like. The concept, you have to have a short term for it, a title, it's naval statecraft. And as I'll go in later, it's actually a combination of several elements that you kind of already picked up on the earlier discussion today. But it's clear world events that the United States is in need of a change on how it conceptualizes and, more importantly, how it executes its statecraft. Going back to 2012 with that first event listed up there, Scarborough Shoal, it was clear that the approach wasn't working, and it continues to not work. But there's a couple marginal successes, and I'll lightly touch on the West Kapala crisis and the Subic Bay issue. Now, that's actually an economic story to talk about. But it's clear that by taking a counterinsurgency approach, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the U.S. Navy most specifically is taking a new course, charting a new course, one that it hasn't taken at this level or scale even during the Cold War. Now, in order for any strategy to be effective, there was a very astute question asked about the American public, or more of a comment from our British friends, and that is you have to have the American public on board. In order to have the American public on board, it's got to benefit them and it has to be understandable by them. Economics matters. And so while I may not be reading directly off the slide, what you see up there in Djibouti, that's U.S. trade. And that is based on enabled by a military presence initially thought or put in place to fight al-Qaeda. And the other picture, of course, was the West Kapala, which I'll touch on lightly. Now, in integrated deterrence, you have to understand your audience. And in a counterinsurgency, the audience is not the Chinese. So the discussion about deterrence, that's all focused on the Chinese and the planners in Beijing. But in a counterinsurgency, to be proactive in executing integrated deterrence, it's got to become integrated action, a campaign plan. And so sequencing matters in context. And when you assess results of your audience, it's the people that are making their livelihoods at sea in the South China Sea. As Hunter very clearly mentioned, the number of fishermen, the importance of seabed resources, most notably oil and the exploration for it, which the West Kapala incident was a case in point. Malaysia is moving further out away from its continental shelf in its own waters to continue this critical resource for their budgets. And it works. The results on that polling were marginally favorable to very favorable for the United States. Now back to the American public. And this slide I want to spend a little time on. There's a backstory to this. This RAND study actually goes back to about 2014 when there was a lot of interest on reducing military presence overseas. Most notably, it was Iraq and Afghanistan, the remnants of that. But the consequences of doing that were not necessarily explicit or clear. And that was the economics that are involved. And what they found, this is developmental economics, what they found was that by reducing the agreements, by reducing your physical presence, again, this was Air Force and Army, so it's landward, that there was a correlation with the reduction of U.S. economy, trade, and directly on our GDP. And you can see there, 50% reduction of our troops and our presence and agreements, $490 billion in 2015 dollars. So significant. But that needs to be also considered and leveraged in an integrated campaign, not just integrated deterrence. The other part of this integrated campaigning is that the context of the region matters. And as you can see on this list here, this is to put some numbers on the connection to the sea by the folks in the South China Sea littoral area. That's the target. That's the audience. And that's why the free and open Indo-Pacific approach that started in 2018-19 in the Trump administration under guys like Matt Pottinger was so effective, because it addressed their needs as well as our strategic interest in the region. And I put that last one up there because it's not South China Sea, but because it has applicability, and that is Prosper Africa, focused in on the engines of economic growth, job creation, and prosperity writ large, and that is the small and medium enterprises. That needs to also be considered in the engagement as a part of a naval strategy in the South China Sea. And then lastly, I'll end on, in order for this all to work, it's clear that there needs to be structural and institutional changes. Those marginal successes in the West Kapala incident, which again, I'll leave it to Q&A to go into more in depth, it's clear, and we're hearing now from the likes of previous Secretary of the Navy, Ambassador Brathwaite, that we need to have a new First Fleet that's dedicated, and that brings structure and focus. It's not necessarily a whole fleet of ships that will materialize, nor does it necessarily have to be. In fact, that might actually be anti-successful if you actually bring in too much of a presence too quick. Better to condition your partners to a new surge of interest and investment. And then also, leaders like Admiral Kitchener is also looking at changing the way that we structure our destroyer squadrons and bringing back readiness squadrons. So there's an awareness that's growing that structurally we're not tuned to this yet. And there's definitely a need and a hunger to actually develop more of those institutional structures to execute an integrated campaign and to have the results of integrated deterrence. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter. There you go.
Thanks, Brent. So what I'm about to talk about is a boil down of an article that appeared in the October issue of Proceedings, which was called, as it says there, One Officer's Lessons from Vietnam. I want to start by admitting something. There's an error in the article. It's not going to affect this discussion, but there is an error in the article. And the article, I mentioned the Marines program in Vietnam, which Hunter cites often, the combined action platoons, and I noted that they were, it was a concept and an operation that didn't require a great deal of cooperation with the Vietnamese. That was 100% wrong. That was an error I can't explain, but I was called on it by the premier academic student of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, Professor Edward Moise. But he didn't call me on anything else in the article. And I was heartened by that. So that line isn't any good, but the rest of it passed muster with the #1 academic expert on the Vietnam War. I just want to point that out. Also, going to the bottom line up front, a bluff, look before you leap. And this was the phone calls that I had with Hunter on this. It says, it's not just SEALs and small craft. There's a whole lot more. And I don't know, I'm not a current theorist of counterinsurgency. I don't use the right vocabulary that's in the counterinsurgency joint doctrine. But I once was a guy that taught about Vietnam, and then I served in Vietnam. And so I talked the talk on counterinsurgency for a year and a half, and then I walked the walk for another year and a half, and that's my background on this. So while I'm not steeped in what's going on right now, and I'm like the rest of you, I sit at Brent's knee at the concepts that are current and being discussed, I know a little bit about when we tried to do this once before. Classic Navy counterinsurgency theory, and there was that during the war, because I taught it week after week after week to thousands of sailors and officers going to Vietnam. Counterinsurgency requires 5 principal lines of effort. Population and resources control, separate the insurgents from the people that they're trying to influence. To do that, you need coastal and riverine forces, and that would include surveillance and interdiction. The Navy then went and did that in Vietnam. Environmental improvement, trying to convince the people that the insurgents are operating with that they should not support the insurgents, they should support the government, the legitimate government. And the Navy had a role in all of that through humanitarian assistance, disaster response, medical and dental civic action programs, all during the Vietnam War, to convince a populace that it was the government side that they should be on. Third, but more famous than the others, is guerrilla and, what am I doing? Guerrilla and counter-guerrilla operations. You have to go out and actually find people and do bad things to them because they're looking for you and trying to do bad things to you and the civilian population you're dealing with. And for that, we had a number of operations in Vietnam. An Army-Navy mobile riverine force in the Mekong Delta, Sea Lords, which was the transformation of a force that was Navy force that was largely doing population and resource control, to counter-guerrilla operations, and of course SEALs and their boat support groups. Also psychological operations were important. Messaging, loudspeaker operations, leafleting operations, entertainment with a message, and the giving out of government of Vietnam swag to the locals. All of that was embodied in Navy counterinsurgency theory and practice during the Vietnam War. But the main part of what my discussion has to do with what do you need besides boats? Because you need stuff besides boats, and that starts with diplomacy. None of this can happen without diplomacy. None of the things that I talked about in Vietnam happened without the diplomacy that led up to American intervention in the war. And you need diplomacy with a host of different countries, as Brent showed some of the main ones. But everyone is different. Everyone requires different expertise on our part. And for some, it has to do with getting required permissions. For others, it has to do with allowing them to accept allied forces. But a lot of diplomacy, and therefore a lot of work with the State Department, is required. Air superiority. You can't operate in coastal inshore waters and on rivers without knowing something that you can only find out from being up in the air. It's not just boats. We learned that the hard way in the Vietnam War, and so the boats, and we had 1,000 boats doing these different kinds of things, needed Seawolf helicopters, Black Pony fixed wing. The Naval Institute did a great job in pulling together a literature that we've got on how those operations happened. But those operations were as vital as what was going on in the boats, even more so. Where's that air superiority today come from? Well, we have drones now. Maybe the boats themselves carry drones. Maybe you need fixed wing, in which case then you need some air bases somewhere You need permission, you need activity there, and what kind of fixed wing are you going to use? Well, we didn't have anything in the Navy inventory in those days, and so they painted a bunch of Army and Marine Corps fixed wing counterinsurgency aircraft black, and we had the black ponies, which were invaluable to backing up the riverine force. So as vital as air superiority was, even more vital is logistics. So John Kaskin is sitting there smiling. You know, a boat is about the size of this platform, maybe a little bigger depending on the boat you're talking about. This isn't a U.S. Navy warship with 90 days of, or a submarine that you can go and go and go until the crew gets tired of it. After a day's operation, it's done. You need food, you need fuel, you need ammunition, you need crew rest, you need all of that, and then it's got to go out again. And all of that has to be resupplied constantly. And that resupply has to reach all the way back to CONUS, to the United States. And it has to go on continuously. And if you don't do that, then you can have all kinds of boats and they'll all be laid up because they're not going to be able to do anything. And in a conference that's themed the Integrated Deterrence, you need other people and close cooperation with other folks besides the Navy, even though this is a maritime and some would think merely a naval or Navy campaign. You need the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard understands fish. As Hunter pointed out, a lot of this has to do with fish. Fishermen, there are rules, there are regulations, and U.S. Navy officers, while we're real smart, don't know an awful lot about that, but the Coast Guard knows everything about that. And so you've got to involve the Coast Guard, especially given the fact that your target audience in many of these cases are fishermen or people who are messing with fishermen or people who are pretending to be fishermen. Ground forces. I talked about the Mobile Riverine Force. One of the peculiarities of the Vietnam War was that the Navy wound up schlepping the Army around the Mekong Delta for 3 years because the Marines were otherwise located up in ICAR, which was largely a ground and air theater. But going into another such event like that, and given the Marines' continued work in this area, and given the concept of EABO, one would expect that the Navy would partner closely with its naval compatriot, the Marine Corps. Special Operations Forces. When things get really nasty and really hairy and really tough, a bosun mate who's on a one-year tour and an engineman and a fireman who are serving on boats and doing it well, yes, they can do it well, but they're not as good at some of these things as a SEAL or a boat support unit. And so they're involved as well. But the command and control relationships are very, very different now than they were then and have to be worked out today. And you need people that know what the heck's going on in all of these countries and on the boats. You need language and cultural mastery. In the Navy, we now have some FAOs, and we have FAOs for these countries, and that's a giant step forward, because in those days, hey, who speaks Vietnamese? Well, the answer was nobody. I knew 3 guys in all of my tours in Vietnam who could speak fluent Vietnamese, 3 Americans in the U.S. Navy. That's 3 out of, I don't know, where were we, 20,000 maybe. You need the kind of cultural mastery. Oh, and most importantly, those few handful of officers that understood the culture and understood the language were constantly being cycled and used by the commanders because they were able to give something that all the rest of us couldn't. Funny story, I managed to concoct my own training program for Vietnam, and I had 12 weeks of Vietnamese language school. That was double what the advisors had, which was 6 weeks. And I got to tell, I mean, in 12 weeks, you can order beer. You can, you know where the bathroom is. But you need more than that. And then finally, which is not thought of very much, you need a training establishment back here to make sure that all of these people that you're talking about are equipped to go in country, both technically and mentally and that training establishment has to be established. And then when they roll back from Vietnam or from whatever the country is, Malaysia or Indonesia, or just being out on the water, being supported by a ship at sea, they wind up teaching at these training facilities. Okay, so you've just taken somebody out of his career pattern, largely a surface warfare officer, for maybe 2.5, 3, 4 years in order to be able to do this. You can do that. You got to plan for it. You got to think about it. And the Bureau of Naval Personnel has to be involved in it. These are unique and sometimes expensive requirements. So that's my sobering. It is not meant to throw cold water on counterinsurgency, far from it. It's meant to say, this is what we went through, and some of it might be applicable, but all of it is complicated, all of it is interrelated, all of it is hard, all of it deals with deterrence, and all of it deals with integration, and you've got to be aware of this because it's more than just seals and boats.
My thanks to you both for being here and for your insightful comments here. Just again to highlight, so Captain Swartz's article is in the October issue of Proceedings. It's One Officer's Lessons Learned from Vietnam. And then Captain Sadler's article is in the July issue of Proceedings. July issue, his article, Win the Contest for a Rules-Based Maritime Order. Highly recommend them, and they are available at the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project landing page of usni.org/maritimecoin. So to start off kind of the discussion here, Captain Sadler, you mentioned briefly in your remarks the U.S. reaction to the West Capella standoff in the Malaysian EEZ. And as you write in the July issue, this was a highly interesting and indeed and really remarkably successful prototype implementation of maritime counterinsurgency, led at the strike group level by Rear Admiral Fred Kacher, at the numbered fleet level by now retired Vice Admiral Bill Mers, and by current then PAC fleet, now Indo-PACOM Commander Admiral John Aquilino. Can you just back up and just walk us through how did this come together? Tell us the story so we understand how this victory came about.
I think I'm good on them. It might be good if we can go back. There's a slide earlier that has like the timeline, and I'll kind of give some of the background. So at that time, I was back here in D.C. So I was a little bit removed from the actual events, but I knew all the main players over at State Department, the folks in theater and in Hawaii. Of course, Admiral Aquilino, I've worked with him numerous times before, as well as others. One individual in particular is worth also bringing up, and that's General Dave Stilwell, who at the time was East Asian Pacific Assistant Secretary at State Department. And he was busy with that red circle. He was trying to figure out when he's going to get the Secretary of State out there. He wanted to do it back in April, March, but the Secretary's schedule was so busy. PACOM, and I know this from where I was before, there's one event in East Asia that you can set your clock to, and it's almost always going to be a crisis: Taiwan elections. 2020, May, inauguration of Tsai Ing-wen for a second term. Chinese and Beijing were not happy about it. So there was a little extra presence in the area. That's what people were looking at. Were the Chinese going to escalate tensions over her inauguration? So there's a lot more forces. So Hawaii, PACOM, and PAC Fleet are thinking about that. Now, several months before, friends of mine, because I just left Malaysia, were telling me about the West Capella. And I also had friends that are Swiss, and they were telling me also from the companies that are involved in some of this research, hey, there's some activity going on that's really not getting a lot of press. While I'm watching events from the outside, it looked like everything was perfectly coordinated. It was not. PAC Fleet, PACOM, they were focused on Taiwan, as mentioned. State Department was trying to get Secretary of State out there, sooner the better, to talk about China's illegal claims in the maritime. But because there was a knowledge at 7th Fleet in particular, Admiral Mers, in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Framework, as it was called at the time, that there was a consideration of economics and military presence, he made some very key statements, and so did Admiral Aquilino, who was PAC Fleet at the time. And it all kind of came together organically in perfect sequence. You had a presence that was already there. It was light because it really wasn't focused on around the West Capella, but the Chinese knew we were there. You had statements coming out of 7th Fleet that clearly connected naval presence with economic activities that were lawful by partner countries, Malaysia in this case, and their EEZ. And then, at the end of all that, you had the Secretary of State, if there was any question by the political elites in Southeast Asia that the United States had no stamina or staying power, came out and said China's claims are illegal. Explicitly, plain language, everyone could understand. It all came together by happenstance. The key thing is, how do you take those lessons and recreate it in a proactive way? And that's kind of like the dirty secret of what I found out in the West Capella incident, but why I keep coming back to it, because it seemed to, on the outside, and my friends in Southeast Asia at the time said it also came together in a nice seemed like it was coordinated and well planned. So hopefully we can redo that again.
Absolutely. I mean, really a remarkable example of what happens when you can depart from that usual playbook of the periodic high-end presence. This was a situation where, in terms of the forces on the ground, or rather on the water, they show up and they sustain a persistent presence, focus on supporting our allies and partners in, in this case, the West Capella, a Malaysian chartered offshore hydrocarbon exploration vessel. And on the subject of, okay, how do you do this kind of on purpose? Captain Schwartz, the campaign you were a part of in Vietnam was certainly a very consciously, deliberative effort to do this in a very institutionalized way. And as you've written in your article in the October issue, a lot of the infrastructure that we relied upon, particularly in the logistics space and some others, that isn't necessarily something that we can rely on today. So I guess I would ask, what steps would you take to begin, if we were to say, okay, let's go and take that very deliberative approach, how would you begin to reconstitute some of those capabilities to begin implementing a maritime counterinsurgency campaign in this very kind of deliberative way, similar to what you experienced directly?
Well, in some ways, the Vietnam War, the early days of the Vietnam War are instructive, because they were similar to the situation with West Capella in that we did not have 1,000 ships, 1,000 boats. We didn't have a training pipeline. We didn't have dedicated aviation. We hadn't figured out the command and control of what was going on in country yet. But we were forward. And in those days, and so this is, I'm talking the late 50s, early 60s, before the full-blown insurgency, counterinsurgency war in Vietnam, there were 7 fleet ships at sea. They had aircraft. There were special operations forces, except they weren't called that then, underwater demolition team folks that later morphed into the SEALs, who had some experience landing on rocks and reefs and islands and so on in the South China Sea. We had forward presence. We had liaison with the State Department. The constant ebb and flow of 7th Fleet ships back and forth doing port visits resulted in close relations between all of the embassies in the area and the 7th Fleet staff. And so you had a situation similar to where we are right now, where we took a number of forces, which people like Morrow were busy back here sizing for China contingencies and Soviet, and Russian contingencies and whatnot. Those forces were able to start an intervention, because that's what the president then directed, an intervention, and then gradually morphed into the kind of counterinsurgency war, for which we needed the boats and for which we needed the Marines, which then resulted in bringing in the air power, bringing in the logistics and so on, and coming up with the full-blown effort that I described. But it all started with the 1950s and 1960s version of what Brent was talking about, discussions in the National Security Council staff. So the way it starts is Brent going around and reminding everybody that we know how to do this, we've got the rudimentary makings of it, and it happened once, in part serendipitously, sure, because he also showed us the areas where this didn't happen, but we did it at least once pretty well, or good enough for just starting off, and we should build from that. What kind of building? Well, State Department's got to get busy talking to people, and they've got to know what they're talking about, so they've got to coordinate with the Navy, and the Navy has got to use, as it did then, the 7th Fleet Commander, because he's the guy on scene, and that's the value added that naval forces give because they're on scene, and then work it from there. And if somebody then decides that what's needed are boats, we go back to Big Navy and say, you got boats? Well, the truth of the matter is there are terrific boats now. They weren't so great in those days. We really didn't have the right small craft and had to go to the civilian market immediately to get some of it, the famous PBRs and the Swift boats. But we've got some damn fine boats now. We just don't have many of them, and we don't have as many as we thought we'd planned to, but we'd know how to do that. They've got to be brought into the action. And then, which is not something that I can explicate on, but is important, they need air. And you got to figure out what kind of air is going to cover those boats, and where's that air going to come from, and who's going to supply it? Supply. And now we're back in John Kaskin's world of the logisticians have got to be in bed with this from the very beginning, because when the boat goes out in the morning and comes back in the evening, yeah, that was a great op, but it's got to do the same thing the next day. And where is it going to get the beans and the bullets and the black oil that's going to sustain that force?
Okay, I'm going to pose one more question to both of you, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. So we've got a number of senior defense officials and congressional leaders here today. Can you talk a bit about how would you frame the role of a maritime counterinsurgency campaign within the larger context of American grand strategy and this overall approach of integrated deterrence and campaigning that is put forward by the new national defense strategy? And then are there particular steps that you would, if you're talking to these congressional leaders, these senior defense officials, what first steps would you take to get the ball rolling? Captain Sadler, why don't you start off?
So the first thing is an acknowledgement of what the challenge is in the framework. So a counterinsurgency construct for South China Sea. It also has application in other places like Gulf of Guinea. But that's the first thing, is an acknowledgement from the top down that that's what's required, because that focuses everything else on the right population. If you focus on the wrong population, you're not going to get results. So focus in on the people that livelihoods are connected to the sea, informed by the governments in which they come from. Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia. Specifically, those are the 5. And things like the Maritime Security Initiative continues. That needs to be expanded and needs to be grown more than it has been. And that's a focus in on those 5 countries. At least it was originally when it was constructed. The other is there needs to be some structure from the National Security Council down. Maybe not in the National Security Council. There was some expectations because it was informed by some discussions before the elections in 2020 that you have Kurt Campbell right now, who's leading an NSC body that's an Indo-Pacific. There needs to be something of that level of importance and stature connected to a day-to-day management of an integrated campaign. And that's the last piece. There needs to be an integrated campaign. There have been times in the past where this has come and gone. Freedom of navigation operations, a few key ones, had kind of this campaign in mind. There needs to be something that's like a year or 2 campaign plan that's integrated, meaning interagency, with elements of it that are cleared for sharing with key partners, Japan most notably, Australia, of course, another one in the area. So you got to have an acknowledgement of what the focus is. You've got to have a leadership structure in place, which doesn't exist right now. I would argue, in NSC and others. And then you have to have a plan. So those are the 3 key elements.
We're part of it. It starts with meetings like this. It starts with making sure that organizations like the Naval Institute and CEO Pete Daly sitting here acknowledge the fact that there's an issue there. And a way to get that issue in front of people is through media, social media, which I'm hardly an expert at, but media such as the Naval Institute, which has its social media, but also has got a journal, and the ability to convene conferences and meetings in places like Washington, D.C. It really, I mean, this is part of it and what has to happen. This creates knowledge spread out among key people, one hopes, and it can't be a one-off. The Navy League or some of the other institutions that are around town could work on this. For that matter, I mean, there's no reason in the world why the Air Force Association couldn't. I mean, they've got a rich history of counterinsurgency, and they're busy touting the new bomber and the new fighter, but that neither of which are going to serve a great deal of help in this kind of a contingency. But there needs to be the beginnings of a campaign, and Hunter is, and they need some key people that are pushing it in order to get it started. And that has to continue, because when a crisis emerges, as happened with West Capella, there's going to be a room full of people. Oh yeah, that's what those guys were talking about at the Spy Museum last month or last year or whenever, and all. And so that's how it has to start, I think. It actually did start that way with the Vietnam War. When you go back and look at the very early days, there were a few people that really pushed it. There were a few people that really understood it. There was a circulation among the officer corps of magazines and newspapers and articles and books by authors regarding the coming storm that they foresaw in Vietnam. And so, and then when things really got tough and the Tonkin Gulf incident happened and people said to the Navy, you got to go do this, the Navy immediately sent a team out to survey in-country and figure out what to do, came back with an initial report, went out, bought a bunch of boats, and started that way. And then from there it built with the logistics, with the air, with the coordination with the Coast Guard, and so on and so forth. We're off to a start on this, I think. We've got prime movers like Hunter and Admiral Daly. We've got a literature that Hunter has sponsored and that the Naval Institute has furthered, so that there's references that you can give to people to read when something happens. And there's a knowledge base of key individuals in town who can be called on, and then mobilize them. And when the government then kicks in, make sure that they remember logistics, aviation, the other items that if they fall by the wayside, the operation isn't going to go as well as you would hope.
Thank you. Do we have questions from the audience?
This will be quick and very specific. Thank you, especially, General, for your service to our country. We appreciate it. Wondering if I understood correctly when you were talking about what was needed for successful coin operation by the Navy today. And I was thinking, my daughter did Spanish at Monterey. She would have done Chinese, but she got to the head of that line, and they didn't need Chinese that day, so she did Spanish. My son, who was a PRT commander in Afghanistan, had quite a bit of training in Pashto, was able to deliver his initial speech. So, and then of course he had an interpreter for those. So my question is, are you saying that the Navy today does not have sufficient access to linguists, whether local interpreters or sufficient people coming from Monterey or wherever, especially speaking Chinese?
Okay. The Navy of the era that I was discussing had almost none of this, and the Navy of today has some. And that's why I mentioned the foreign area officers, and we have that.
Okay.
But my sense is, and this is speculation on my part, I can tell you what happened in 1965, but not today, right? And that is, my suspicion is that we don't have enough of them, that they probably, because of the time lag in policy, there's probably guys spitting out of schools who know Pashto when they should be learning Malay or Thai or Chinese, for that matter, and we need more of that, probably. But that's a probably. If I had some representative from the Cultural Affairs desk at the Bureau, he might say, no, you don't understand. We've got whatever. But we're better than we were when we started the last time we did this. We're probably not as good as we should be.
Thank you very much.
I definitely want to add on to that. So I'm also a foreign area officer myself. I
There we
got
go.
pulled in fairly senior on because of my background in Asia and an affinity and understanding of several of the languages. And so the Navy I want to say there's a sea story in this, but I will not bore you with the long run. It goes back to Danzig when he was secretary in '99 in an engagement with my admiral as the flag lieutenant, Admiral Walt Dorn. And that is the importance of having people that understand the region and have human connections. In one case was a sailor who was related to the president of then in the Philippines, and how that was a case study that the Navy needs to take more advantage of. Fast forward to 2005, establishment of the Foreign Area Officer Program. Problem is it's still very small. And the National Defense Strategy in 2018, by clearly articulating China and then also Russia in that list, made it easy for the institution, the Navy, to then put limited resources to training up China linguists and then getting those linguists downrange where they matter, in the embassies, the consulates, around the region, not just in China. And then also, more importantly, at key decision-making offices back here in DC, in the interagency. So you can infuse that naval knowledge that also has a deep regional expertise and also can pick up the phone and talk in the language of your partner. Because that opens so many doors that are beyond, I mean, it's anecdotal, but it does work, and it has happened time and time again. So,
Good to hear. Thank you both. Xie.
We have, I see Greg Lewis here at the microphone, and I'm just going to take a brief moment because Greg Lewis and Gary Lehman, who's also right here in the front, wrote a fabulous article on the role of the Marines for the July issue called "The Role of Stand-in Forces in Maritime Coin" on page 52 of the July issue. Greg, what do you got for us?
Thank you for the shout out, Hunter, and good morning. Fantastic panel. Retired Marine logistician and regional area officer. Very excited to hear the discussion today. You mentioned the logistician. So as a logistician, I've got some ideas on that. Hey, we're getting gas for the ships, getting bullets, ammunition, all that good stuff. And this will jump into the counterinsurgency. One of the approaches or tactics we used in Afghanistan, money is a weapon system. Mm-hmm. Those logisticians, hey, gas up our boats and stuff. You know what? They're going ashore, and they're spending money on the economy, on that gas and that chow, and that's coming off the economy and so forth. I look at organizations like Naval Facilities Command, NAVFAC, Commando Naval Installations Command, CNIC, Navy Expeditionary Combat Command, NAVSUP, Army Surface Deployment Distribution Command. You've got this tremendous presence of logistics organizations already out there. A significant amount of money, $15 billion in, I think, overseas contracting support for engineering, military sleeves command, husbanding contracts, and so forth. That is a huge amount of money as a weapon system, or money as a non-lethal weapon system. How can we use that, or better use that?
So I'll take one stab at this. And in the recent past, so the Fat Leonard scandal had an impact in this realm.
Yes.
So port visits went down, but also still there's a lingering fear of dealing with local contractors because of the potential of the perception, real or imagined, the perception that by engaging in economic activity with your local partners in the port, that you may be corrupted. Now, that culture, that stigma is still there. That's part of what needs to get addressed if the Navy or the DoD is actually going to do this effectively. And a integrated maritime campaign, counterinsurgency campaign in the South China Sea. The other is there's a capacity question. We don't have the contracting, which means we need to leverage the interagency like USAID, which, by the way, is not really in line with the military on all things. There's different service cultures there that also have to be addressed. That's not to say one is better or worse than the other. It's just a reality. So those are two things. One, capacity, and the other is there's this stigma. And having Fat Leonard make his great escape and get recaptured brought it back yet again. So we're still living with this, unfortunately.
I have no vignette that can top that. I think that's right on. The one thing that does occur to me in listening to Brent and listening to your comment and question has to do with the role of contractors. Contractors are an important, vital, given the American system, way in which we go to war. And finding the proper role for civilian contractors in an insurgency. And civilian contractors, in many cases, their motive is, I get paid more doing this than doing something else, and that's why I'm doing it. That's not the same motives as the sailor or the Marine or the Coast Guardsman. And but it's not an unfair or unexpected view on the part of the contractor. He's a contractor. And making sure that the contractors are fulfilling their support obligations, which is what many of these logisticians and folks are doing, is a good thing. But there's also a control, and there's also an issue regarding making sure that the contractors aren't doing things that are actually detrimental to what you're trying to do. And if I had to make up the lengthy, long list of all the things that I missed, that I said, I think contractors probably would have been number 7 and number 8. That's an important issue area as well.
Okay. Well, we could have this conversation go longer, and I'm afraid to say that we're running out of time because we've got Congressman Gallagher here who's zorched over between votes, and we need to get him on stage. But I want to thank our 2 panelists, Brent and Peter, and our moderator, Hunter, for giving us this excellent conversation, which highlights a problem and that needs to be addressed. And I'm going to give each one of you, War Transformed, thank you again. I know your time is precious. And let's give our panel a big hand. Okay. All right. Well, our next speaker is Representative Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, he represents Wisconsin's 8th District, and he served 7 years on active duty as a Marine counterintelligence and human intelligence officer and regional affairs officer. He commanded intelligence teams in Al-Anbar province, Iraq, and worked for 3 years with the intelligence community here in Washington. He currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, where he's the ranking member on the Subcommittee for Military Personnel. He's on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So let's give a big hand and welcome Congressman Mike Gallagher.
Thank you. For the record, I said you should keep Sadler on stage because he's much smarter than I am on sea power issues. But I'm honored to be with you here today. I have to say, though, given my previous criticism of integrated deterrence, I had to do a bit of a double take when I first received the invite. And now that I'm here, I feel a bit like a Packer fan on game day at a Bears bar. I will try to avoid a bar fight, but I do want to elaborate on my concerns with integrated deterrence and hopefully spark some discussion for later in the day. Quick side note, speaking of the Packers, even in an otherwise dark season, it is gratifying to know that Aaron Rodgers still owns the Bears. So, okay, integrated deterrence. As Secretary Austin has described it, integrated deterrence means using every military and non-military tool in our toolbox in lockstep with our allies and partners. Integrated deterrence, and I'm quoting here, is about using existing capabilities and building new ones and deploying them all in new and networked ways. So in other words, integrated deterrence is about better leveraging non-military elements of national power, allies, and new technologies to strengthen or at least maintain deterrence. So while these may not be new or earth-shattering ideas, there's nothing inherently objectionable about that. In fact, in a little bit, I will talk about a few things I think we could actually integrate into deterrence. But for now, let's look at integrated deterrence as it currently exists. Secretary Austin has been explicit that the Pentagon should play an ancillary and not primary role under integrated deterrence. As he put it, the Department of Defense is here to help support the Department of State. Assistant Secretary of Defense Mark Carlin has further emphasized that under integrated deterrence, the Pentagon is knit closely with the rest of government. The problem in my mind is that while the Pentagon is talking about doing less under integrated deterrence, the rest of the interagency is not talking about doing more. If you examine the strategic plans released by the Department of State, Treasury, and Commerce, the term integrated deterrence is nowhere to be found. And in fact, if you search around non-defense agency websites, except for one or two passing mentions from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, you will not find a non-defense U.S. government official talking about their agency's responsibilities under integrated deterrence. And the clearest example of this disconnect comes from the recently released National Security Strategy. So if you had a truly whole-of-government strategic approach, that would start at the interagency or at the National Security Strategy, in this case, at that level, and then it would filter down to specific cabinet departments, right? Yet this is precisely the opposite of how integrated deterrence was rolled out by the Pentagon, a full year and a half before the publication of the National Security Strategy. And integrated deterrence is mentioned 5 times across the NSS's 48 pages. And tellingly, in each instance, it appears under the strategy's defense pillar, not as part of an overarching whole-of-government framework. In fact, the strategy's only extended treatment of the concept comes in the form of an awkwardly pasted call-out box, which, to be fair, does pay lip service to leveraging the full array of American advantages, including diplomatic, intelligence, and economic tools. But the proof is in the pudding. Outside of the call-out box, the NSS includes nothing about how the rest of the interagency will contribute to integrated deterrence. So intentional or not, the NSS confirms what I have long suspected. Integrated deterrence is in the military's rucksack, but it's not on the radar at all for the rest of the interagency. All of this then raises an obvious question. What explains the disconnect between the DoD's emphasis on integrated deterrence and the rest of the interagency's seeming indifference to the concept? I have a theory, and fair warning, this is the part of my speech which may be akin to shouting, "Go Pack Go" at a Bears bar, but it gets better afterwards, so just bear with me before you start booing. So I believe, or at least my concern, is that the Biden administration is using integrated deterrence as a smokescreen to underinvest in conventional hard power while being able to claim that they're enhancing deterrence. And so I think there's 2 things going on here. For one, many senior leaders in the administration, starting with the president himself on down, fundamentally underappreciate the continued centrality of hard power in the 21st century. We got a taste of this last fall at the UN when President Biden wish-cast that we were closing an era of relentless war and opening one of relentless diplomacy, in which, quote, many of our greatest concerns cannot be solved or even addressed by the force of arms. Or look at John Kerry, who just days before Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or his most recent invasion of Ukraine, expressed confusion about the looming invasion, saying, quote, I thought we lived in a world that had said no to that kind of activity. A truly remarkable statement given that Kerry was Secretary of State during the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine. This mindset even manifests itself in the National Security Strategy, which, despite some genuinely good language on China and Russia, ultimately labels climate change, not revisionist authoritarians, one of whom is engaged in the largest land war in Europe since World War II currently, as the existential challenge of our time. That's factor 1. The second factor here is that the administration wants to focus its energy, attention, and resources overall on domestic priorities rather than on the national defense. The numbers here speak for themselves. Since entering office, the Biden administration spent over $2.7 trillion between its American Rescue Plan, infrastructure bill, and the questionably named Inflation Reduction Act alone. At the same time, if you take the the defense budget was a cut in real terms, factoring in inflation, and the inflation estimates were, Milley admitted to us that they were wrong. But if you take the $12 billion added under the Biden administration last year relative to the pre-Biden FY21 defense spending baseline, and then you throw in the administration's request for an additional $59 billion this year, you're still only looking at about $71 billion in defense spending over the baseline compared to the $2.7 trillion he spent across the the budget on his signature domestic initiatives. So as the president is fond of saying, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. Well, the administration could not be more clear that it does not value investing in hard power relative to domestic spending, despite looming warning signs of war, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So at the same time they're underinvesting in the national defense and spending lavishly on domestic priorities, the administration is trying to project their enlightened sensibilities onto our adversaries, particularly Putin, scolding him that instead of invading Ukraine, he should focus on building back better. It's this last part that I think is ultimately most revealing. In sort of the perfect sheltered bubble of DC, the administration doesn't want to spend money on items like military readiness, force structure, and theater logistics. They just want to build back better in a world that has evolved beyond the force of arms. So enter integrated deterrence. It's a perfect opportunity for the administration to have its cake and eat it too. After all, it posits a world in which DoD can play a secondary role and be funded accordingly, and yet we can still deter conflict through other, less pricey elements of national power. It's a neat solution, admittedly, for the administration. There's just one problem. Integrated deterrence has not worked. In fact, integrated deterrence failed its most high-profile test in generations. Barely 1 month into the war in Ukraine, anonymous Pentagon officials were bragging to the Washington Post that integrated deterrence comes out smelling pretty good from this. Yet tens of thousands of dead Ukrainians and millions more displaced should not look, smell, or feel good. And eventually, after we went back and forth in an Armed Services Committee hearing, Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley admitted that integrated deterrence failed in Ukraine, and that short of the commitment of U.S. military forces into Ukraine proper, Putin was not deterrable. Considering we actually did the opposite, preemptively pulling American troops out of Ukraine, sailing out of the Black Sea, limiting the pre-war transfer of defense equipment, Austin and Milley's assessment was a critical, if overdue, admission about the supremacy of hard power, and one that has profound implications for how to deter a war with China over Taiwan. And if anything, coming out of the 20th Party Congress, I would submit she is more outwardly committed to taking Taiwan than Putin was Ukraine prior to February 24th. So now that's where members of my political party usually stop. We paint a scary picture of the world. We criticize the president's team for being weak. And we tell you that if only you put us in charge and we spend more on defense, none of this would be happening. I'd like to try and move beyond that today and in the final part of my speech. Despite my concerns over the concept of integrated deterrence and the jargon, I recognize that there are patriots in the Biden Pentagon who are working incredibly hard to defend this country. Moreover, I want this country to be strong, and I believe we are strongest when our foreign policy is built on a bipartisan foundation. I believe that helps deterrence. And in light of that, and since I sincerely appreciate the invite and the spirit of this conference, I'd like to suggest 3 areas where I think we can usefully integrate things into deterrence. 3 areas where I sincerely would like to work with this administration as we're entering divided government and we'll have control of the House. First, in fact, I'm looking forward to integrating a committee gavel into my deterrence in the House, so that's going to be a useful change. First, now that we're no longer bound by the INF Treaty, we need to integrate diplomacy to surge long-range conventional precision fires in 3 concentric rings and 1 bullseye across the Pacific. The first island chain, second island chain plus the Central Pacific Islands, and 3, the outer edges of the theater, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Australia. Credit to CSBA for a fantastic report on this point. These rings then revolve around a 4th and decisive point, the bullseye, Taiwan itself. To build this regional defense in depth, we will need to negotiate access and basing rights with host countries, particularly Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, so that we can disperse intermediate-range missiles and other critical assets across the theater as soon as possible. Second, I do believe there's a tangible way we can integrate technology and missile technology in particular into deterrence. In light of that three rings approach to posture in the Indo-Pacific, while existing weapons would work for deployments to Taiwan in the first island chain, in the second ring, we will literally need rocket science to develop and deploy longer-range maritime strike tomahawks and other intermediate-range missiles. And in that third ring, that outer ring, we will need to harness advanced energetic materials to develop even longer-range intermediate missiles that could range the Taiwan Strait from places like Australia's Northern Territory, even from Alaska. And here, there's promising technological partnerships like AUKUS that could be decisive, complementing the crown jewel of nuclear submarine technology sharing with a more near-term joint development of long-range strike capabilities. By working with our allies to develop new and longer-range missiles, we can both better defend Australia and help us construct the capabilities we need to destroy PLA ships and amphibious landing craft at port, in the Strait, and on Taiwan's beaches. Third and finally, while we must avoid the temptation to believe that other elements of national power could serve as a substitute for the cold logic of hard power, we do need to integrate economic warfare into our plan to impose costs on the Chinese Communist Party. Think back to the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. The Obama administration then was forced to improvise a sanctions regime against Putin over the course of 48 hours. For maximum effect, to say nothing of international buy-in, sanctions, export controls, and the like should be coordinated and socialized ahead of time. Consequently, we need to integrate Treasury, Commerce, the SEC, and other instruments, not the SEC for your football fans, the SEC. We should disintegrate the SEC, as far as I'm concerned. The SEC, other instruments of economic power into the Pentagon's Taiwan war games, so that we aren't simply rehearsing our military response, but building out that muscle memory across the interagency. And in that way, Xi must fully understand that he faces not only the full might of the U.S. military, but the full weight of our tremendous economic power if he decides to try and take Taiwan by force. So, in conclusion, as a member of the loyal opposition, I will continue to critique integrated deterrence and other buzzwords that I believe cloud our thinking and sap our sense of urgency. But make no mistake, my criticism stems not from partisanship, but from a genuine desire to see deterrence hold where it matters the most. And I stand ready to work with my colleagues in the administration on the central challenge of our time, and perhaps the greatest challenge our nation has faced in recent years, which is ensuring that Taiwan does not share in Ukraine's fate in the near term, while positioning the country we all love to win this new Cold War with Communist China over the long term. In fact, 3 times in the 20th century, our forefathers rose to the occasion during moments of extreme peril. Now it is our turn. And I'm confident that with your help and with the decisive action that we need to reverse course before it's too late, we can prove that we are worthy of that inheritance and up to the challenge. So thank you. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have with what time we have. After the thunderous applause, yeah. Said 10 minutes, a little over 10 minutes for questions? Yes, ma'am. Or, I don't, yep.
Go ahead, please.
Yep.
Greatly appreciate the insight, sir. Very nice to hear you speak. Given you have been fairly outspoken about congressional integration into wargaming, both in War on the Rocks and with CSIS, I think I would pose something perhaps as an argument for integrated deterrence, something between hard power and diplomacy. Given Mr. Steyer's postulations about maritime counterinsurgency, how might we begin to wargame better in this idea of integrated deterrence in the gray zone with the competition?
Sure. Great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer other than, well, let me give you sort of a little snapshot. So I went to the Naval War College, it must have been over a year ago, and this was a few weeks after they had done Global 14. And at the time, I got sort of a cursory brief on what happened, but didn't get the full brief. Unless there's something going on behind the scenes that I'm unaware of, despite repeated requests, the Navy still has not come to brief me or my colleagues on Global 14. And did Global 15 or whatever it's called already happen? I mean, we're already in the next wargaming cycle. So that just illustrates there's something fundamentally broken here. And it could just be distrust, right? It could just be the kind of pervasive executive branch doesn't trust Congress, and because Congress talks to too many reporters and leaks all the time, they don't want to brief anything. I totally get that. But until we have a sense of, okay, here's what we think the PLA is going to do in this scenario. Here's what we're able to do. Here's when we go Winchester on key weapon system. Here are the gaps. How can I make responsible decisions as a member of the Armed Services Committee on what to authorize and what to fund if I don't have that understanding? And so I think it's worth assuming the risk of bringing key members of Congress, I'm not talking to anybody, but the members that are on the national security committees that pay attention, and that's a shockingly small number right there, into that process early. In fact, you could go further and have us participate in the war game in some capacity in the way that I know they have Indo-Pacom officials participate in that. The final thing I'd say is it was like pulling teeth to convince the Navy to let some of the guys from Halsey Alpha brief us in a secure environment. That took over a year. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, we need to get past that and kind of have this recognition that we're all on the same team. We can be open about sort of our gaps and our capability and capacity shortfalls, and I think that will lead to a more productive budget cycle. So that's not a good answer to your question. That's more an illustration of the problem. I don't currently know because I'm not privy to them. I don't know if the war games account for some of the gray zone stuff you're talking about. Maybe you could do sort of a targeted war game focused on that. There's been some good work done with think tanks in that regard that members of Congress have participated in. So I'm open to ideas if you have them. But it's a great question.
We do have one going on next week, and you are more than welcome to attend.
When is it?
Monday to Friday next week.
Oh, Monday to Friday. Okay. Where is it happening?
NSWC Indian Head, sir.
Interesting. Okay. If my wife gives me a hall pass to do that, happy to attend. Yeah.
You're more than welcome. I'll contact your staff.
Thank you, Congressman. Retired surface warfare officer. Spent a lot of time out in Westpac. I'd like your 3 rings. I'm kind of confused about the bullseye. Are those rings going to be trying to counter the cross-strait invasion? And if so, I don't think that's going to be as helpful as actually going to the source of that cross-strait invasion, the ports and the coastline of China. So there's an escalation factor there that I don't think we're ready to stomach.
The bullseye, that's a great point. The bullseye, and I need a better metaphor. I just didn't want to keep belaboring the Bears-Packers football imagery. The bullseye is just meant to suggest that, at least in my opinion, the best thing we can do to enhance deterrence in the near term is arming Taiwan itself to the teeth, right? Based on the assumption that any basing agreement with Japan over the Ryukyus or whatever posture we need in the northern Philippine Islands is going to take some time. Clearing that backlog of now $18 billion worth of FMS sales to Taiwan that's been approved but not delivered, figuring out a way to get creative with smart mines and anti-ship missiles, figuring out perhaps maybe something we could do with these Harpoon Block 1Cs that we're going to spend a bunch of money demilling. That to me is the most bang for the buck. And I think if you look at the history of the previous 3 Taiwan Straits crises, it's hard power on the island itself that's had the biggest impact. The first one, Eisenhower goes to Congress, gets an advanced authorization of military force, but the second one he deploys Matador cruise missiles. Third Taiwan Strait crisis, Clinton, it's the biggest display of force since the Vietnam War. But to go back to the first one and the advanced authorization for the use of military force, which thankfully he never had to use, that kind of gets to the second part of your question, right? A lot of our, I think, theory of victory in that scenario is built on the assumption that we'll be able to prosecute targets on the mainland. That's a massive assumption. And quite honestly, politically, I don't know if the President of the United States came to Congress today and said, I need that authority, and I don't feel like I have it inherently under Article 2 of the Constitution, I'm not sure how that vote would go. Because I don't think we, and I put myself in this, we haven't successfully made the case for why Taiwan matters. That's what we have to do to explain to the American people in terms they understand non-SWO terms, no offense, why it matters, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, just my comment would be, based upon my experience out there, we were never able to talk about those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I want to get to what I think is really the most dangerous situation, and it's not the invasion, it's a strangulation of Taiwan. It's the mining capability that China has, the submarine capability, which we never talk about. We assume our submarines are going to win this fight. We never talk about that. To me, that's the greatest threat. Why am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. And in fact, and listen, I'm a recovering Arabist. So I'm not trying to tell you that I'm a sinologist or that I'm an Indo-Pacific expert. But I do think if you look at Xi's speeches over the last 2 years in particular, he seems to be preparing his population for what he calls struggle, but really economic pain, right? And I don't think we're prepared for the level of economic pain that would ensue in a strangulation strategy, right? Americans are going to start freaking out if they can't get the newest iPhone, let alone suffer the economic consequences of that strangulation approach. So I actually agree with your point. We'll get that.
Hi, Congressman. Mallory Shelbourne with USNI News. Your amendment to the NDAA about the Navy's presence during peacetime operations, could you talk about the thinking behind that amendment when you wrote it, what your intention is, and also what's your reaction to OSD's objection to the amendment?
Well, maybe I'll start with that one first. I was disappointed, though not surprised, to see OSD's objection. That being said, it's my understanding that the CNO supports it, and I hope, I don't know if he's speaking here today, but I hope he'll say that loudly and repeatedly, and I do have some cautious optimism that despite OSD's objection, it will survive the NDAA process, and we'll be voting on NDAA hopefully in the next 48 hours. So the Title X change, I think, will remain, and maybe that OSD objection is kind of a microcosm of a broader problem all of us who care about sea power have seen over the last few years, and it's been a bipartisan problem, right? You have some elements within the Pentagon that just don't seem to believe that we need a bigger Navy, right? That seem to think this commitment to a 355-ship Navy, which is instantiated in U.S. law now to get there as soon as practically possible, I think was the term, is just kind of, it's like, it's asymptotic. We'll never quite get there, right? And I totally reject that. And ultimately I've come to believe that only a president who believes in sea power understands that if I look at a map of our priority theater, there's a lot of water on that map, can empower a Secretary of Defense who can then empower a Secretary of the Navy to actually build a bigger Navy. So that's the second part of your question. First part, why the change to Title X to account for the Navy's peacetime mission? It's my belief that in a unique way, the Navy plays a day-to-day deterrent function that is currently not captured in its Title X mission, which talks only about sort of the warfighting aspects of the Navy as opposed to day-to-day deterrence. And it's my further belief that by capturing that in Title X, it will then give the Secretary of the Navy, the CNO, and all general sea power advocates more of a foundation to make that argument in the E-ring when they're battling with whoever is in OSD over this issue, and ultimately allow us on the Hill to better fund the Navy the nation needs.
Thank you.
Or we could do a lightning round, yeah.
Oh, sir, good morning. I'm from Taiwan, working in the Navy. And first, thank you so much for showing your support to bolster Taiwan security. And I would like to hear about your perspectives on what parts you think the U.S. military can work with Taiwan military to further increase Taiwan's defense posture. Just in line with the three rings you just mentioned. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think there's the hardware component, which is we need a lot of anti-ship missiles on Taiwan. We need to figure out whatever our plan for smart mining is. There's a training component. I've been an advocate for dramatically expanding our training programs with Taiwan, not just active duty, but National Guard as well. And then I think there's just sort of like a not war gaming, but a war plan component in that what is the structure We used to have something called the U.S. Taiwan Joint Defense Command, I believe it was called. What is the modern version of that? My understanding is it doesn't really exist. There's some concerns about sharing certain information. We just need to get that structure in place so we're not making it up on the fly should the worst happen. So I'm giving shorter answers because I think I'm out of time and I want to get our last two. So
thank you, Representative.
Yeah.
One thing I really want to get at least your opinion on, is public pressure and how that can impact foreign policy, including our deterrence. That meaning, I think in Ukraine's example, we saw a sufficient amount of public support for Ukraine that saw rapid action against Russia's aggression. And I don't think that there's enough of those conversations to really happen that can promote that public support for more proactive measures rather than what we saw with Ukraine, where we failed to deter the aggressor.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to mobilize ahead of time, but just look at, just the devastation in Ukraine. All the more reason why we in Congress and our colleagues in the executive branch need to be doing everything possible to, as I said before, kind of make a more effective argument to the American people for why this matters. I'll just quickly say, there's a narrative out there that, and my party in particular, is kind of in this more isolationist moment right now. First of all, I don't think that's that's not like the median Republican. I just don't think that's accurate. The second thing is that's sort of been true of America writ large. If you kind of believe the Colin Dweck reluctant crusader hypothesis, we tend to just periodically go through these cycles where we look inward and then something disastrous happens and then we mobilize, right? There's something in our DNA along those lines. But I think what helps us make this argument is to remind ourselves that ours is a fundamentally defensive strategy, right? For those people who are concerned that we went overboard in the global war on terrorism, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, there was mission creep, well, we're not talking about that with respect to Taiwan. We're talking about defending the status quo defending the free world against totalitarian aggression, right? Our challenge, to quote Secretary Mattis, is to hold the line. And I think that's a compelling argument that you can make to most Americans, even those who maybe aren't as preoccupied with the great problems of geopolitics. Last question.
Good afternoon. Congressman Gallagher, my name is Veronica Cartier. I thank you for your bringing up the issue of budget and economic warfare against China. And my question is, do you think we have to reduce loan from China? And how Congress control and deeply study what China can and cannot do based on their investment in the U.S.?
Yeah, so three quick points. One, I do think over time, at some point it's problematic that China owns so much of our debt. If for no other reason that it aggravates me that in a few short years we're going to be spending more money to service the interest on our debt than on national defense, and a lot of that's going to be going to China. But that's a bigger question of how do we reduce our overall entitlement problem and our unfunded liabilities, which we don't have time for today. When I think about sort of broader economic statecraft vis-a-vis China, I think in terms of offense and defense. Kind of defensively, I think we need to determine what are the areas where, no kidding, we cannot afford to have dependency on China, right? No one has a problem if we're selling soybeans from Wisconsin to China or buying cheap t-shirts from China, but it is problematic that so many of our advanced pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. They threatened to cut those off, by the way, in the beginning of the pandemic and plunge us into a sea of coronavirus. I would further submit to you, if you're interested in energetics, and I see a lot of young sailors here today, who you all look very smart, read the energetics report. I forget the number of it, but it's brilliant. They talk about how our energetics industry is at least one generation behind, and a lot of it's sole sourced domestically in quasi-government facilities or foreign sourced and dependent on China. So there are areas we're going to have to figure out a way to onshore or nearshore because we can't be dependent on China. And then in terms of offense, I think it's long past time for us to stop sending taxpayer money and retirement dollars to finance China's military modernization and subsidize its ongoing genocide. Particularly if you're a university endowment or you're a state and local pension fund, I think Congress is going to start scrutinizing those things. So, short answer to a very complicated question. Thank you all. Sorry to talk so much. This is great. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Congressman, thank you so much. As a native Chicagoan, lifelong Bear fan, and somebody married to an SEC school graduate, really appreciate your analogies here today. This has been great. Actually, seriously, appreciate your remarks. War Transformed by Mick Ryan.
Great. Thank you so much.
so much.
Appreciate that. This is cool. I'll read it.
Appreciate
Great.
it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, this is the end of our program. I want to thank our speakers who were terrific. I think we all got a really good twist of the cube today to look at integrated deterrence from different angles. I want to thank our sponsors again, Leonardo DRS, Lockheed, and Mantech for their support, without which we couldn't put on this event. And I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a happy holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you at other U.S. Naval Institute events in the new year. Thank you very much.